Section 1. The World Before the War. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world that looks almost like ours but isn't. A world where the neon signs never went dark, where the chrome on the cars never stopped gleaming, where every kitchen had a smiling robot cheerfully offering to make dinner. A world where the radio still played big band jazz and crooning tenors, where the advertisements promised a tomorrow full of gleaming promise and atomic age optimism. A world where the skyline was different lower, somehow more horizontal, full of futuristic curves and sweeping fins, like the whole of civilization had been styled by the same art director who designed the tail fins on a 1957 Chevrolet, where the corner drugstore sold Nuka-Cola alongside aspirin and comic books, and where every public building had a display case of model robots that children pressed their noses against on Saturday afternoons. A world that smelled of ozone and promise and the particular quality of mid-century optimism that was so thick you could almost chew it. That world is the one Fallout was born from, and it is both beautiful and deeply terribly wrong. The Fallout universe is one of the strangest thought experiments in the history of fiction. It asks a deceptively simple question. What if the cultural momentum of the 1950s never slowed down? What if, instead of the counterculture movements, the youth revolutions, the long social upheavals of the 1960s and beyond, instead of all of that, the world just kept marching forward in its pressed slacks and polished shoes, fueled by the conviction that nuclear power would solve everything, that science was salvation, and that America's promise was destiny? In the real world, nuclear energy existed alongside 1,000 other technologies that developed in parallel. Transistors became semiconductors. Semiconductors became microchips. Microchips became the internet. And eventually, the whole structure of communication and information transformed into something the 1950s would not have recognized. But in the Fallout timeline, that branching path never happened. The divergence occurs sometime after the Second World War, around the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Exactly when and how the timeline split is left deliberately vague, more suggestion than fact, but the results are clear. Nuclear technology became the dominant force in everything, and all other avenues of technological development either stalled or took radically different paths. By the early 21st century in the Fallout universe, you had fusion-powered automobiles sitting in driveways across Middle America. You had household robots, the iconic Mr. Handy units and their various cousins performing domestic duties with a cheerful synthetic voice and a rotary saw arm. You had power armor that turned soldiers into walking tanks. You had a weapons industry that had perfected the terrible science of destruction on a scale that should have given anyone pause. But culturally, emotionally, socially, the world was still 1953. The same anxieties about communism, the same faith in corporate authority, the same belief that the government was basically trustworthy and that the scientists in their white coats were working for the public good. That tension between a technology that had advanced dramatically and a culture that had not moved at all is at the absolute core of what Fallout is. It is a world of profound cognitive dissonance, and it produced exactly the kind of catastrophe you might expect. The corporations that thrived in this world are worth understanding in detail, because understanding them is essential to understanding how the pre-war world produced the wasteland. Each of the major corporate entities in the Fallout universe is a study in what happens when private power is allowed to operate without genuine accountability, when profit and institutional interest are fully aligned with government authority, when the distinction between a company serving the public and a company using the public for its own ends has dissolved entirely. General Atomics International produced the household robots that became so embedded in American domestic life that the distinction between having a robot and not having one was, by the 2070s, a significant class marker. The Mr. Handy units hovering, multi-armed, equipped with a cheerful synthetic voice and a rotary tool attachment were in enough homes that their presence was normalized to the point of invisibility. They cooked meals and cleaned floors and entertained children and maintained household systems and, in some cases, had been in the same family for long enough that they had accumulated something resembling personal histories with their owners. The attachment that formed between humans and their household robots was genuine enough that its exploitation, General Atomics, had designed certain features of the Mr. Handy personality to encourage dependency and discourage. Purchasing competitor units was sophisticated manipulation at the scale of millions of households. After the war, The robots continued running. Many of them are still running 200 years later, still faithfully maintaining the households of families that have been dead for generations, still cheerfully offering tea to the empty rooms. The resource wars began in earnest around the year 2052. The world had been quietly running out of oil for decades, and no one had really found a suitable replacement fast enough to prevent the consequences. The United Nations, which still existed in the Fallout timeline, tried desperately to broker solutions and ceasefires as various nations began military conflicts over the remaining reserves. It failed. By July of 2052, the United Nations had dissolved entirely, its final press release appearing in the Capital Post newspaper on July 27, 2052, a moment that went largely unremarked upon by a public already drowning in war news from a dozen different fronts. The European Commonwealth had been fighting a grinding war with the Middle East since 2052 over the last accessible oil reserves. China, facing its own desperate resource shortfall, launched an annexation of Alaska in 2066, a bold and devastating move that sent shockwaves through the international community. The United States responded by pouring enormous resources into defending the Alaskan front, eventually deploying the first generation of powered armor suits, the T-45 model, to stabilize what had become one of the bloodiest ground conflicts in modern history. The Alaskan campaign dragged on for years, a meat grinder that consumed lives and treasure and produced a generation of veterans who came home changed in ways no one had prepared for. Meanwhile, the United States government was quietly transforming itself. Fearful of internal dissent and communist infiltration, the government reorganized the country's 50 states into 13 commonwealths in an attempt to streamline governance and suppress regional independence movements. The intention was to create something more manageable, more controllable, more resistant to the kind of decentralized organizing that the government associated with subversive activity. What they got instead was a volatile patchwork of resentments, political tensions, and power struggles between the commonwealths that made the whole system perpetually unstable. The corporations fared better than the government in many ways, simply because they were more agile and more willing to pursue profit wherever it led. Vault-Tec, which had started as a modest defense contractor, had grown by the early 2000s into one of the most powerful private entities in America, having cornered the market on nuclear shelter technology. Vault-Tec, another defense contractor, had pioneered the forced evolutionary virus and power armor research under contracts with the Department of Defense. Robco Industries, owned by a brilliant and deeply unusual man named Robert House, produced most of the robots and computer systems that the country ran on. Poseidon Energy controlled enormous fuel reserves and infrastructure. General Atomics International made household robots and energy weapons. Nuka-Cola, the flagship product of the Nuka-Cola Corporation, had become so deeply embedded in American culture that it was essentially a second currency. These companies were not separate from the government in any meaningful sense. They were interlocked with it, feeding it, guiding it, benefiting from its contracts and its wars. The distinction between public policy and corporate interest had blurred so thoroughly that it was essentially meaningless. When the government wanted something done, a new weapon, a new containment strategy, a new line of propaganda, it called on these corporations, and they delivered, and in return they received guaranteed contracts and regulatory protection, and a kind of untouchable status in American life. The resource wars ground forward into the 2070s. The Sino-American War, which had started with China's annexation of Alaska in 2066, had become a global-scale conflict that consumed enormous resources on both sides. American forces eventually reclaimed Alaska in 2072, pushing the Chinese back in a brutal campaign called Operation Anchorage. It was a victory, but one that left the country exhausted and increasingly desperate. The oil hadn't come back. The gas shortages were real and grinding. Food prices climbed. The government tightened its grip. Riots broke out in major cities over fuel and food, and they were suppressed. And all the while, Vault-Tec was building its vaults. The official story was simple enough. With the world clearly spiraling toward nuclear confrontation, the government had commissioned Vault-Tec to construct a network of underground shelters capable of housing Americans in the event of nuclear attack. 1,000 residents per vault, protected behind 3-foot-thick, lead-reinforced walls, with air filtration, hydroponic farming, power generation, and everything needed to sustain life indefinitely. 122 vaults were planned for construction across the country. The advertisement said, humanity's answer to the unthinkable. The advertising campaign for the Vault program was extraordinary, even by pre-war standards. The Vault Boy, that impossibly cheerful cartoon figure with his thumbs up and his permanent smile, appeared everywhere that the program's reach extended, which was essentially everywhere. Public service announcements ran between television programs showing families being calmly ushered into vaults during a practice drill, the door closing smoothly behind them, the announcer's voice warm and reassuring, as he explained that in the event of nuclear emergency, Vault-Tec would be there. School children took field trips to the Los Angeles demonstration vault, where they could see the gleaming interior and receive Vault Boy stamps on their hands and take home brochures explaining how to secure a vault reservation for their family. The vault ticket system, the mechanism by which 1,000 spots per vault were allocated among the American population, was presented as a lottery, a fair and random process. It was neither fair nor random. The criteria for vault assignment reflected priorities that Vault-Tec and its government partners had established years before the lottery was conducted, priorities that had everything to do with the research agenda and nothing to do with any egalitarian principle of survival. Communities that had received vault slots were sometimes told about it, sometimes they weren't. Their vault tickets allocated automatically as part of regional emergency plans that they had never been shown. The real story was something considerably darker, and we will return to it in detail. For now, it is enough to know that by October of 2077, the vaults were full, the tickets had been allocated, the doors had closed. The people inside had said goodbye to the sunlight. Some of them had said goodbye to parents, to children, to friends who hadn't made the list and sealed themselves in against whatever was coming. What was coming arrived on the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077. The war with China had finally reached its cataclysmic end. Nuclear warheads began falling at 11:47 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. No one is quite sure who launched first. That detail became irrelevant almost immediately, because within hours the entire planet had been bathed in fire. The Great War lasted approximately 2 hours. That is the darkest joke embedded in everything the Fallout universe is and does. 2 hours. The whole glittering edifice of the pre-war world, all its chrome and neon and robot butlers and fusion-powered cars and Nuka-Cola and propaganda and corporate malfeasance and political paranoia, all of it ended in roughly the time it takes to watch a film. 2 hours, and then nothing. Nothing but the wasteland, and the long silence after, and the slow and terrible process of figuring out what comes next. Before we follow the survivors into that silence, there is so much more to understand about the world that burned. There is the story of the vaults, what they really were, what they really did, and why the people who built them chose to do it that way. And that story begins with the quiet recognition that Vault-Tec, from the very beginning, was never really in the business of saving people. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. There is a lot more of this world left to explore together. Section 2. Vault-Tec and the Great Experiment. The advertisements for Vault-Tec were masterworks of mid-century optimism. A smiling family in matching jumpsuits, blue and yellow, clutching their vault entry papers as a kindly Vault-Tec representative ushered them toward the great circular door. Safety. Security. The American dream, preserved underground for the duration of whatever unpleasantness might occur above. The company's mascot, a cheerful cartoon figure called Vault Boy, gave a thumbs up from every billboard, every brochure, every cereal box side panel. He was impossible to dislike, which was rather the point. What Vault-Tec was actually building, beneath the cheerful surface of its marketing, was something that would become one of the most disturbing revelations in the entire Fallout universe. The vaults were not designed primarily to save people. They were designed primarily to study them. The nature of the program emerged from a collaboration between Vault-Tec, the federal government, and a shadowy collection of interests that would eventually coalesce into the faction known as the Enclave. The problem, as they framed it, was this. If nuclear war came, and if some portion of humanity survived, and if the world eventually became habitable again, what kind of people would be needed to rebuild? What psychological profiles? What social configurations? What kinds of stress could humans endure? What kinds of communities would remain cohesive and what kinds would collapse? These were, in a certain light, legitimate scientific questions. The methods chosen to answer them were not legitimate in any sense that would be recognizable to human ethics. Each vault, or nearly each vault, because a small number were genuine shelters without attached experiments, was assigned a specific set of conditions designed to test a particular hypothesis. The residents who entered those vaults were not informed that they were research subjects. They believed they were survivors. They were given a cover story, a set of parameters that felt like reasonable emergency conditions, and they were left to live within those parameters while their reactions were recorded, their psychological states monitored, their social structures documented. They were, in the language the program would never have used in any public document, human lab rats. The experiments ranged from the uncomfortable to the genuinely monstrous. Let's sit with some of them, because understanding what Vault-Tec did is essential to understanding everything that came after why the wasteland is the way it is, why certain communities survived and others didn't, why certain forms of human trauma recur across the landscape of the post-war world. Vault 101, just outside Washington, D.C., had a very specific mandate. It was never supposed to open. Every other vault had, somewhere embedded in its design, a protocol for eventual emergence, a signal that would be sent when surface conditions allowed, or a scheduled date when the doors would unlock. Vault 101 had no such protocol. The experiment wasn't about the specific conditions inside. It was about the role of the overseer, the vault's appointed leader, always a planted Vault-Tec operative in maintaining a closed, controlled society indefinitely. The residents were told via increasingly fabricated radio broadcasts that the surface was still uninhabitable, that there was no hope outside the vault, that the overseer's authority was the only thing standing between them and oblivion. This was a lie. The broadcasts were recorded before the bombs even fell. Vault 101's overseer had a secret tunnel to the surface and access to radio communications with the outside world. The people in the vault had nothing. For generations, the residents of Vault 101 lived and died within those walls, believing they had no choice, and their reactions, the politics, the resentments, the occasional attempted rebellions were all dutifully recorded. Vault 87, located in the hills west of Washington, D.C., was the site of experiments with the forced evolutionary virus. Residents were deliberately exposed to an early strain of FEV, and their transformations were documented. Most became super mutants. The vault that was supposed to be their protection became the laboratory where they ceased to be human. It was from Vault 87's mutant population that the master, the dominant super mutant intelligence of the West Coast, would eventually draw much of his army in the post-war decades. Vault 112 in Virginia housed its residents in a state of suspended animation, hooked up to virtual reality pods. The VR simulation ran continuously, a constructed world that the residents could perceive as real. But unlike most virtual reality scenarios, the residents of Vault 112 were fully aware that what they experienced was simulated. The real experiment was observing how they responded to that awareness over an indefinite period, and what the social and psychological dynamics became among people who shared the knowledge that their world was not real. The simulation was administered by a rogue scientist named Stanislaus Braun, who used it primarily to indulge his own darkest impulses, trapping the residents in scenarios of his own devising, and watching their responses with the detached curiosity of someone who had entirely stopped thinking of them as people. Vault 92 had white noise pumped through the speakers sound specifically calibrated to trigger violent psychotic breaks in its residents, who were all musicians selected for the experiment. The hypothesis being tested involved whether high-stress audio environments would produce violence even in a community drawn from a supposedly sensitive, culturally elevated population. The results were predictable and ghastly. Vault 34 in the Mojave was crammed full of weapons, far more guns, ammunition, and explosives than any 1,000 people could reasonably need or safely store. The experiment was straightforward. What happens to a community when it has access to overwhelming lethal force and is confined in close quarters with no external threats? The answer, predictably, was not good. Vault 11, also in the Mojave, told its residents that one of their number had to be sacrificed each year, or the entire vault would be destroyed. The vault-wide computer system delivered this mandate at regular intervals. The residents were not told that this was a fabrication. For 75 years, the people of Vault 11 organized themselves around the annual selection of a sacrifice, with the resulting political maneuvering, social stratification, and carefully documented murders playing out across generations. Eventually, 5 residents refused to sacrifice anyone else. The vault system rewarded their defiance by unlocking the exit, but not before informing them that every previous sacrifice had been unnecessary, that the threat had never been real, and that they could have simply said no at any point during those 75 years. Vault 75, beneath a mall in Massachusetts, accepted only children under the age of 18, separating them from their parents who were sent elsewhere. The children were raised in the vault and subjected to a program of genetic testing and augmentation, being progressively evaluated and weeded out. Those deemed genetically superior were advanced, while those deemed inferior were eliminated. The intent was to produce a generation of genetically superior soldiers and administrators who could be deployed after the war to rebuild civilization according to Vault-Tec's vision. Vault 95, somewhere in the Commonwealth, filled its residents with people who had struggled with addiction and provided them with legitimate recovery resources for the first 5 years. It seemed for a time almost kind. Then Vault-Tec activated the vault's hidden drug dispensers, flooding the common areas with chems, and watched to see what happened to a community that had been carefully built around sobriety when that sobriety was suddenly and deliberately destroyed. Vault 4, in California, was the setting for a series of experiments involving human augmentation and hybridization, the combination of human and animal genetic material to create something new. The results were not what anyone would call a success, at least not for the people involved, and the documentation of what was done there makes for difficult reading even in the clinical language of Vault-Tec reports. Eventually, the residents of Vault 4 managed to overthrow their overseers and reclaim their vault, transforming it into something unusual in the post-war world, a community that actively welcomed and cared for people who had been victimized by Vault-Tec's other experiments, a refuge built in the wreckage of one of the program's cruelest laboratories. The few genuine shelters, the so-called control vaults, had their own problems, simply because isolating 1,000 people underground for decades, even without deliberate sabotage, produces extraordinary social pressures. But they fared significantly better than the experiment vaults, and many of them eventually produced stable communities that became the seed populations for post-war settlements and, eventually, factions. Vault 15, in California, was stocked with residents from wildly differing political and social backgrounds, the experiment being whether ideological diversity would produce conflict or cooperation. It produced both, in roughly equal measure. The vault eventually fell apart, with different groups leaving at different times and going on to found communities in the wasteland. One of those groups founded Shady Sands, which would eventually become the capital of the new California Republic. Another group left and became raiders. The Khan's Raider gang, whose descendants would appear across multiple Fallout games, trace their origin to the splinter group that left Vault 15 with stolen supplies and a grievance. Vault 21, in Las Vegas, was run entirely by gambling, disputes, leadership decisions, resource allocations, vault residency itself, all of it was settled by games of chance. The experiment tested whether a society built on statistical randomness could remain functional. The answer was complicated, and the vault was eventually taken over by Robert House, who won ownership of the entire facility from its overseer in a single legendary gambling session. And then there is the question of the 30 vaults that were built simply as props. The Los Angeles demonstration vault was open to the public before the war as a showcase, a gleaming advertisement for the program. It had no experiment. It had no residents beyond tour groups. It was pure theater, designed to generate public enthusiasm and, through that enthusiasm, political support for the funding that allowed Vault-Tec to build everything else. The people who entered the vaults on October 23, 2077 did so believing they were entering a shelter. Some of them were right. Most of them were something else: data points, experimental subjects, human material to be observed and recorded, and eventually discarded or harvested for whatever insights their suffering could provide. They trusted the cheerful vault boy with his thumbs up, and the vault doors sealed behind them, and the bombs fell outside, and in many cases, the real horror was just beginning. Understanding the vault program changes how you see everything in the wasteland. Every faction, every settlement, every survivor community has a relationship to those sealed doors, whether they came from one, sought to find one, or simply grew up in the shadow of what emerged from them. The vaults were Vault-Tec's greatest project and their most profound crime, and 200 years later, the wasteland is still living with the consequences. Section 3. The Great War and the 2-Hour Apocalypse. At 11:47 in the morning on October 23, 2077, the world ended. Not slowly, not with warning, not with the gradual darkening that anyone had time to prepare for. The missiles came in waves, and within approximately 2 hours, the surface of the planet had been transformed beyond recognition. There is something almost incomprehensible about that number, 2 hours. Historians of the pre-war era had written endlessly about the risk of nuclear escalation, about the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, about how rational actors would never truly press the button because they would understand that pressing the button meant the end of everything, including themselves. The Fallout universe's great tragedy is not that those arguments were wrong, they may not have been, but that by October of 2077, no one was making rational decisions anymore. The resource wars had ground the major powers down to their last reserves. The Sino-American conflict had been bleeding both nations for over a decade. The desperation that had taken root in governments and military commands on both sides had a quality to it that made calculation difficult and impulse catastrophic. Who launched first remains one of the great unanswered questions of Fallout lore, and the games have generally declined to answer it definitively. The ambiguity is likely intentional. It doesn't matter who fired first, because the result was the same regardless. The missiles flew, the retaliatory launches came seconds later, and within 2 hours, the entire strategic calculation that had been the foundation of nuclear deterrence for over a century, the idea that the threat of mutual destruction would prevent its occurrence, was proven definitively wrong. The geographic reality of the Great War shaped everything that followed. The warheads were targeted primarily at military installations, major cities, and industrial centers, which meant that the destruction was not evenly distributed across the landscape. Some areas were hit repeatedly and thoroughly. Washington, D.C. received enough warheads to reshape its physical geography, and the Potomac River became something almost unrecognizable in the immediate aftermath. The California coast, the Mojave, the Great Plains, the Appalachian region all were struck, but with enough variation in intensity that the resulting wasteland was never uniform. Some places were scorched to sterile glass. Others retained enough biological material to support mutated life almost immediately. The post-war landscape is partly the product of this uneven devastation, which is why you can stand in the ruins of downtown Boston and find thriving mutant ecosystems within walking distance. The nuclear exchange did several things to the planet simultaneously. The most immediate was the obvious one, the thermal pulses and blast waves that destroyed physical structures and killed millions outright. The second was the radiation, which saturated the soil and water and atmosphere in concentrations that would have seemed fantastical before the war. The third, and in some ways the most consequential for the long-term shape of the wasteland, was what the bombs did to living biological material that survived the initial blast. Radiation in the quantities the Great War produced does not kill everything. Some organisms, particularly insects, which have a higher natural radiation tolerance than most mammals, thrived almost immediately. Others adapted through processes that were far too fast to be natural evolution and were almost certainly accelerated by the specific radiation profiles of the bombs used, as well as by the presence of the forced evolutionary virus that had been spread through research programs, military experiments, and the simple chaos of contaminated water supplies. The creatures that emerged from this cauldron of radiation and mutagen radroaches, bloatflies, rad scorpions, the early ancestors of deathclaws, the first stirrings of what would eventually become mirelurks along the coastlines began appearing within years of the Great War, sometimes within months in the most contaminated regions. The sky changed. This is one of the aspects of the post-war world that the games render visually, but that is easy to take for granted. The sky in the wasteland is permanently altered. The combination of nuclear debris, soil particulate, ash from the firestorms, and atmospheric chemical reactions produced a perpetual haze that gives the wasteland its characteristic amber and gray color palette. The sun still comes through, but filtered, softened, stripped of some of its light spectrum. The seasons still exist, but less reliably. Rainfall comes, but what falls is contaminated enough that drinking it unfiltered is a slow death sentence. The plants that survived either went dormant or mutated. Trees in some regions retained their basic structure while becoming slightly strange, a little too gray in the wood, a little too sparse in the leaves. In other areas, entirely new species developed out of the ruins of old ones. Plants that could extract some nutritional benefit from heavily irradiated soil, plants with leaves that had a faint bioluminescence from concentrated radiation. The vines that crept over pre-war concrete were often the first visible sign of biological recovery, reclaiming the ruins with a patient, slow, relentless growth that would have seemed hopeful if it hadn't been so eerie. The water was the most immediate and persistent crisis for survivors. Pre-war water infrastructure, the pipes, the treatment plants, the reservoir systems had either been directly targeted or had failed catastrophically when the power grid went down and the maintenance personnel died or fled. The rivers and lakes and aquifers were contaminated with radioactive material at concentrations that made even small amounts dangerous over time. Finding clean water became the defining challenge of post-war survival, the single resource around which communities were built and wars were fought. This is not incidental to the Fallout story, it is central. The struggle over clean water drives the narrative of Fallout 3 explicitly, but it underpins almost every other conflict in the series as well. Water is what humans cannot live without, and in the wasteland, clean water was nearly impossible to find. The first years after the Great War were largely undocumented, because the people living through them were too busy surviving to write anything down, and much of what was recorded was later lost. We know that the Vault populations survived, sealed in their underground chambers. We know that certain groups who had access to pre-war bunkers, military facilities, or simply happened to be in areas that received less direct radiation survived in some form on the surface. The emerging picture, pieced together from terminal records, survivor testimonies in later years, and the archaeology of post-war settlements, is of a world in profound shock, silent in ways that no living person had ever experienced, with the background noise of civilization simply gone. No more engines, no more planes, no more power lines humming, no more radio broadcasts except the ones that played from automated systems running on backup power, which continued for a few weeks before going silent one by one. The silence of the post-war world was reportedly one of the most psychologically devastating aspects for those who experienced it directly, more than the ruins, more than the radiation, more than the shortage of food. The absence of sound was the absence of civilization, and for people who had grown up saturated in the noise of the modern world, it had a quality of absolute wrongness that was almost impossible to articulate. Into that silence, very slowly and with enormous difficulty, humanity began its long work of rebuilding. Section 4. The Capital Wasteland. 200 years after the bombs fell, the ruins of Washington, D.C. are still magnificent and still terrible. The buildings that were not directly struck by warheads still stand: the Washington Monument, portions of the Capitol Building, the Lincoln Memorial, but they stand in a landscape that has been completely transformed. The Potomac River is a sluggish, brownish thing, slower than it should be, carrying enough contamination that swimming in it unprotected would be inadvisable. The metro tunnels beneath the city became, in the post-war centuries, an ecosystem unto themselves, dark, labyrinthine, contested by feral ghouls and super mutant patrols, and the occasional desperate scavenger. Above ground, the tangle of ruins is treacherous and beautiful in equal measure, the old world's grandeur preserved in decay. The region known as the Capital Wasteland covers approximately what was once the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, stretching into parts of Maryland and Virginia. By 2277, the year when the events of Fallout 3 occur, a fragile ecology of survivors, settlements, and factions has established itself across this broken landscape. The dominant tension in the Capital Wasteland at this point in history is between two forces, the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. We will come to both of those factions in detail later. For now, it's enough to understand the context they operate in, because the Capital Wasteland's version of the Brotherhood is subtly but importantly different from the organization's original form out west, and understanding that difference illuminates something essential about how ideology changes when it has to confront human need. Elder Owen Lyons led the Capital Wasteland chapter of the Brotherhood on a mission that had originally been about hoarding pre-war technology, the Brotherhood's traditional mandate, which we will examine closely in its own section. But Lyons had been changed by the Capital Wasteland itself. The sheer scale of human suffering in the ruins of D.C., the children scavenging in the rubble, the settlements barely hanging on against super mutant raids and raider attacks, it had done something to Lyons that most Brotherhood elders would have considered a weakness. He had started caring. The Lyons chapter of the Brotherhood became something unusual, a military force that actively protected civilians, fought super mutant incursions, cleared raider camps, and invested in the long-term security of the communities around them. This humanitarian drift was controversial within the Brotherhood's internal culture. A splinter faction calling themselves the Outcasts broke away from Lyons' chapter entirely, condemning his deviation from the Brotherhood's core mission and dedicating themselves to the traditional work of technology recovery and preservation. They weren't wrong. From within the Brotherhood's own framework of values, Lyons had genuinely changed what the organization was doing. He had simply decided that the Brotherhood's institutional priorities mattered less than the people dying outside the Citadel's walls. The Citadel itself, the Brotherhood's capital wasteland headquarters, was built into and around the ruins of the pre-war Pentagon. This detail carries a certain grim poetry. The Pentagon, which had been the nerve center of American military power before the war, was now the fortress of a quasi-religious military order dedicated to technology hoarding and, in this particular instance, civilian protection. The building's deep bunkers and reinforced structure made it an ideal base, and the Brotherhood had spent years reinforcing and expanding it, filling its vaults with salvage technology and its workshops with scribes cataloging every piece of pre-war knowledge they could find. The main story of Fallout 3 follows a character whose father, James, had dedicated his life to Project Purity, an attempt to build a water purifier large enough to clean the radioactive contamination out of the Potomac River and make millions of gallons of clean water available to the people of the capital wasteland. The project was staggering in its ambition. Clean water in sufficient quantity would not just save lives, it would change the fundamental calculus of survival in the region, reducing the desperate competition for resources that drove so much violence, and making it genuinely possible to build sustainable communities. James had worked on Project Purity for years before the events of the game, eventually being forced to abandon it when the work became impossible without resources he couldn't acquire alone. He had taken refuge in Vault 101, raising his child in the vault's controlled environment, keeping his work alive in his mind if not in practice. When he slipped out of the vault in the night to resume the project, the story that unspooled behind him was one of the most personal in the series. A grown child following a parent through the ruins of the world, trying to understand what mattered enough to walk away from everything safe. The Jefferson Memorial, where Project Purity was housed, stood on the banks of the Potomac as a kind of monument to the project's ambition. The domed building, with its inscriptions and its circular colonnade reflected in the water of the tidal basin, had been repurposed into a research facility, its interior hollowed out for machinery and equipment, its dome still intact above the scientific apparatus assembled within. Getting the purifier to work required not just engineering expertise but a GEC, a Garden of Eden creation kit, the pre-war terraforming device that Vault-Tec had built for the purpose of eventually restoring devastated landscapes to habitability. The Enclave, which had relocated from its destroyed California oil rig to a bunker called Raven Rock in the mountains west of D.C., had its own designs on Project Purity. Their agenda was poisoning. Not the simple destruction of the project, but its capture and redirection, filling the Potomac's water supply, not with pure water but with a modified strain of FEV designed to kill everything that had been contaminated by radiation since the war, which meant, in practice, nearly every human being living in the capital wasteland. Ghouls, super mutants, and even regular humans whose biology had been subtly altered by 2 centuries of low-level radiation exposure, all of them would be killed by the modified virus in the water supply. The Enclave's president, a Zax supercomputer running a fabricated personality called John Henry Eden, had concluded that the only way to rebuild America was to purge the contaminated and start again with whatever pure-blooded stock had survived in isolated, radiation-free environments. It was genocide framed as restoration, dressed in the language of patriotism and renewal. The battle for Project Purity became a confrontation between those 2 visions of the future, the Brotherhood's version, which despite all its internal contradictions genuinely wanted to see clean water reach ordinary people, and the Enclave's version, which wanted to use that water as a delivery mechanism for the end of life in the capital wasteland. At the center of it all stood a single figure, freshly emerged from Vault 101, following their father's footsteps through the ruins of Washington, D.C. The weapon that tipped the balance of that final battle was perhaps the most gloriously absurd thing in the Fallout universe. Liberty Prime, a 40-foot-tall pre-war combat robot built to fight communists that had never been successfully deployed because no one had been able to power it sufficiently. The Brotherhood's scribes, working with the technology they had been hoarding for decades, finally cracked the power problem. Liberty Prime strode across the ruins of DC, throwing tactical nuclear warheads like a man pitching baseballs, its speakers blasting anti-communist rhetoric at volumes that could be heard across the entire downtown ruins. It was simultaneously the funniest and the most terrifying thing in any of the games. A perfect crystallization of the Fallout universe's dark comedic sensibility, the same machinery built to fight one war, still doing its job long after the war it was built for had ended everything. Project Purity activated. Clean water began flowing through the Potomac. The settlement at Rivet City, built inside a massive aircraft carrier beached in the Potomac, one of the capital wasteland's most remarkable communities, helped coordinate the water distribution. Megaton, the city built around an undetonated nuclear bomb in its crater center, received its share. Big Town, the settlement of children and young adults who had aged out of the underground city called Little Lamplight, got access to resources it had never had. The capital wasteland was not saved. Nothing so simple as a water purifier could undo 2 centuries of damage, but something changed. Something that had seemed impossible became possible, and in a world as hardened as the wasteland, that matters in ways that are difficult to overstate. The capital wasteland is, in many ways, the most emotionally direct of Fallout settings. It wears its themes on its sleeve: the cost of idealism, the weight of parental legacy, the question of what humanity owes to its survivors. The ruins of the American capital give these themes an enormous visual weight, the broken monuments to democratic ideals standing over a landscape of desperate survival. It is not subtle. But then, neither is the subject. Section 5. The Mojave Wasteland. Somewhere east of the ruins of Los Angeles, the desert opens up into something that almost feels, on certain evenings when the light is right, like it might be beautiful. The Mojave Wasteland is drier than the capital, more open, the ruins less densely packed, and the distances between them vast enough that the sky becomes a genuine presence, enormous and amber, and occasionally starred by the lights of New Vegas on the horizon. New Vegas. That light on the horizon is the thing that defines everything about the Mojave Wasteland, and understanding it requires understanding the man who kept those lights on through 200 years of nuclear winter. Robert Edwin House was born in 2020, the scion of a wealthy Las Vegas family who lost his inheritance to the legal maneuvering of his half-brothers and emerged from that early betrayal with 2 things: a relentless drive to prove himself and a gift for mathematics and probability that bordered on the supernatural. He founded Robco Industries in 2037 and built it, through a combination of genuine brilliance and total ruthlessness, into one of the dominant technology companies in pre-war America. By 2077, he controlled a vast network of computer systems, robotic manufacturing, and infrastructure contracts, and he had become wealthy enough to pursue a personal project that bordered on the delusional. House had calculated with the kind of obsessive precision that he applied to everything that a global nuclear exchange was coming. He had spent the years leading up to the Great War building a system to protect Las Vegas. A network of 77 Securitron robots, a massive satellite array, a defensive missile system capable of intercepting incoming warheads, and a device that he had engineered to allow him to survive in a life-sustaining pod indefinitely without physical deterioration beyond a certain threshold. His calculations gave him a 94% confidence interval that he could protect the Las Vegas Strip. He was nearly right. The actual number came out at 93%. 14 warheads struck the Las Vegas Valley instead of the 0 he had planned for. The casino resort boomtown took a direct hit. The suburb of Searchlight was contaminated. But the Strip itself, the Luxor, Caesar's Palace, the Bellagio, and the others survived largely intact. The neon signs stayed lit. The fountains did not run for long without maintenance, but the structures stood. House himself survived in his pod, connected to an enormous computer system in the Lucky 38 casino, maintaining enough cognitive function to continue operating his Securitron network, but not quite enough to direct complex strategic action for the first few decades. He watched the world outside through his cameras and sensors and waited, patient as only someone who had engineered his own survival could be, for the moment when he could act again. By 2277, the Mojave Wasteland had been shaped by House's presence for over a century. He had emerged from his deepest stasis decades earlier, rebuilt enough of his systems to begin actively directing events in the region, and constructed what had become the most improbable thing in the post-war world: a functioning economy. The New Vegas Strip, the Tops, the Ultra Luxe, the Gomorrah, was operating as an actual entertainment district, drawing travelers from hundreds of miles in every direction, offering gambling and shows and food and the closest thing to the old world's pleasures that still existed anywhere on the continent. The new California Republic, which we will examine in detail in its own section, had been pressing east into the Mojave for years, driven partly by the need for resources and partly by the almost irresistible pull of Hoover Dam, the pre-war hydroelectric wonder that, if it could be held and operated, would provide enough power and water to transform the NCR's capacity. House had allowed the NCR to use the dam and the ruins of McCarran Airport as military bases in exchange for recognizing his sovereignty over the Strip. The New Vegas Treaty was an unusual arrangement, a city-state negotiating with a nation, but House's military position and the leverage of the Strip's economic activity had made it work. Into this complicated arrangement came Caesar's Legion, and the story of the Legion begins, like almost all great Fallout stories, with a person and a book. Edward Sallow was born after the war, grew up in a community of the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian academic organization dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge and providing medical care to wastelanders, and was sent in his early 20s on a missionary assignment into the tribal territories east of the Colorado River. He was brilliant, restless, and deeply frustrated with what he saw as the followers' inability to actually change anything about the wasteland's endemic violence and disorder. During his time among the tribes, Sallow found a box of pre-war books, including a comprehensive history of the Roman Empire. He read it with the intensity of someone finding a roadmap to a destination he had always wanted to reach. The Roman model: rigid hierarchy, absolute discipline, the absorption of conquered peoples into a unified identity, the use of strategic terror to maintain order struck him not as historical curiosity, but as practical solution. He had the charisma to make others see it too, and he had the operational intelligence to begin implementing it. He took the name Caesar. He began forging the disparate tribes of the Colorado River region into a unified military force, assimilating smaller groups and destroying those that resisted, creating a culture with its own language, its own ranks, its own mythology in which Caesar was a godlike figure who had always existed to lead his people to glory. By 2281, the Legion controlled a vast territory east of the Colorado River and was pressing its forces toward the Mojave and the prize of Hoover Dam. The Legion does not allow women in combat, enslaves the populations of conquered communities, though the nature of that slavery varies by individual in ways that range from marginally tolerable to genuinely horrific. Outlaws chems and alcohol, destroys most technology it captures rather than using it, and maintains order through a system of punishments designed to make disobedience more frightening than death. It is, by any external metric, a brutal and authoritarian structure. And yet, and this is the Fallout universe doing what it does best, Caesar has a point, or at least an argument. The roads within Legion territory are genuinely safe. Commerce functions. The warlordism and constant bandit raids that devastate most wasteland regions do not occur in Legion-controlled territory, because the punishment for banditry under Caesar is crucifixion. The trains run on time, metaphorically speaking. Order has been purchased at an enormous human cost, and the question of whether that cost is worth paying is left deliberately unanswered. Standing between the Legion and its ambitions was the Battle of the Hoover Dam twice, in fact, in events separated by 2 years. The first battle went badly for the NCR, and the uncertain aftermath defined the political landscape the player enters when they arrive in the Mojave in Fallout New Vegas. The second battle, toward which the game's entire narrative builds, will be decided partly by the player's choices: House, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, or a fourth option: complete independence for New Vegas, managed by the player character themselves through an AI assistant called Yes Man. Each represents a genuinely different vision of how civilization might be rebuilt, and each has costs and merits the game presents without a clear answer. The Mojave itself is a landscape of extraordinary contrasts. Good Springs, a small town where the game begins, is the distilled essence of wasteland frontier life: a few dozen people, a general store, a saloon, chickens scratching in the dirt, and the constant low-level fear of what might come over the hill tomorrow. The strip is visible on the horizon from almost anywhere in the valley. Its light's a beacon of something that looks like civilization, though whether it actually is depends entirely on what you think civilization means. In between, the desert is vast and populated by deathclaws in Quarry Junction, NCR military camps strung along Highway 95, Legion slave caravans moving under armed guard, and communities like Novak, a town that grew up around a defunct tourist attraction, a giant dinosaur figure whose interior was converted into a sniper's nest and used to guard the town from attacks. The Mojave is the Fallout game where the moral weight of the choices feels heaviest, because it is the most explicit about the fact that every option has consequences, and every faction has both a compelling argument and a damning failure. It is the most thematically ambitious of the series, and its landscape carries that ambition wide and beautiful, and full of death, like most of the things worth caring about. Section 6. The Commonwealth. Boston, Massachusetts is 350 miles north of Washington, D.C., and it is, 200 years after the bombs fell, known as the Commonwealth, a place that has developed its own distinct character, its own specific horrors, and its own peculiar relationship with what remains of the pre-war world. The Commonwealth received significant warhead strikes in 2077, but unlike the capital wasteland, it has not developed into a fully lawless wasteland. Instead, it occupies a strange middle state, devastated but not completely broken, with enough institutional memory and enough salvageable infrastructure that communities larger and more stable than most wasteland settlements have emerged. The city of Diamond City, built inside the old baseball stadium Fenway Park, is perhaps the most successful human community in the post-war Commonwealth. 2,000 or 3,000 people live within its walls, organized enough to have a functioning mayor, a newspaper, a detective, and shops that operate on a stable enough economic basis that the word shop means something. But the Commonwealth's defining feature, the thing that makes it unlike any other region in the Fallout universe, is the presence of the Institute. The Institute is the thing the Commonwealth fears above all others. It is the ghost under the bed, the presence in the dark, the reason people look at their neighbors sideways. Because the Institute makes synths, and synths look exactly like people, and the Institute has been known to replace people to take a person from their life and substitute a synthetic duplicate so perfect that even those closest to the original person cannot tell the difference. The paranoia this generates is pervasive and corrosive. Anyone could be a synth. Your husband, your friend, the settler who showed up at your camp 3 months ago and has been nothing but reliable and helpful ever since. You cannot know. The Institute has ensured that you cannot know. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology, CIT, had been one of the pre-war world's great universities, a Massachusetts Institute of Technology analog in the Fallout universe. Its underground research facility survived the war, and the survivors who sheltered their professors, students, staff, their families, became the founding population of the Institute. Not immediately, the organization as it existed by 2287 was built by the children and grandchildren of those original survivors, who had spent the intervening decades developing the scientific program that would make them the most technologically advanced entity in the post-war world. The Institute's formal founding is dated to 2110, when the descendants of the CIT survivors organized themselves under that name and established their governance structure. Their early work was largely focused on survival and resource management. The underground facility was an extraordinary resource, including an experimental nuclear reactor that provided power indefinitely, but it needed to be maintained and expanded. Exploration parties went to the surface for supplies and to evaluate the wasteland's condition. They found a world in desperate shape, and they made a collective decision that would define their character for the next century and a half. They would not rebuild the surface. They would retreat further underground, seal themselves off from the chaos and violence above, and pursue their scientific work in isolation, sharing nothing with the people struggling to survive in the ruins overhead. The rationalization for this decision was that the Commonwealth was too unstable, too violent, too radioactive for any long-term research program to function. The Institute scientists told themselves that their work, pure research, advancing human knowledge, was ultimately more valuable than any humanitarian intervention they could make. They were wrong about this, and the games present enough evidence to make that wrongness clear. But the reasoning was internally coherent in a way that made it genuinely seductive to those who relied on it. The synths began as a practical solution. The Institute needed workers for hazardous surface missions, salvage runs, reconnaissance, the management of resources that required physical presence in contaminated environments. They built the first generation of synths for these purposes, simple robot constructs, clearly mechanical, useful but limited. The second generation was more sophisticated humanoid in shape, with some basic speech and response capabilities, capable of more complex tasks, still clearly machines, still recognizably not human. The third generation was different in ways that redefined the moral landscape of the Commonwealth entirely. The Gen 3 synths were indistinguishable from humans. They had faces, voices, mannerisms, apparent emotions. They could carry on conversations. They could form relationships. They could develop, over time, the complex inner life that we associate with consciousness. The Institute built them this way deliberately, for operational purposes. A synth that could pass as human could infiltrate communities, gather intelligence, manage populations from within in ways that a visibly mechanical unit could not. What they did not anticipate, or perhaps did not want to think about, was what happened when a Gen 3 synth began to believe it was human, or began to question its own nature, or began to want something other than what it was programmed to want. The ones that escaped, and some did escape, or were covertly freed by a resistance movement called the Railroad, became human, in every meaningful sense, in everything except origin. They had memories, preferences, fears, loves. They wanted to live. The Institute's policy of recapturing escaped synths and wiping their memories before redeploying them was, from one perspective, the maintenance of expensive equipment. From another perspective, it was a recurring act of erasure that is difficult to describe with any word other than murder. The Railroad was organized around the belief that Gen 3 synths were people. It operated in secret, using codes and signs based on the Underground Railroad that had helped enslaved people escape bondage in American history. A deliberate and pointed choice of reference that the game does not ask the player to accept uncritically but presents with full awareness of what it implies. Railroad operatives risk their lives to spirit synths out of the Institute's reach, provide them with new memories and identities, and give them a chance at lives of their own. The Minutemen, another of the Commonwealth's major factions, were something older and humbler, a volunteer militia organization that had at various points in its history provided the Commonwealth's scattered settlements with something like mutual defense. By the time the game's events begin, the Minutemen had been effectively broken by a series of disasters and betrayals, their numbers reduced to a handful, and their reputation damaged enough that rebuilding trust was as difficult as rebuilding military capacity. Their eventual rehabilitation, if the player pursues that path, represents the Fallout series' most optimistic vision of post-war recovery, not the imposition of order by a powerful faction, but the gradual rebuilding of community solidarity and mutual aid. And the Brotherhood of Steel arrives in the Commonwealth aboard an enormous airship called the Pridwin, recognizable on the horizon even from 50 miles away, its searchlights sweeping the countryside at night. The Commonwealth's Brotherhood chapter is led by Elder Arthur Maxson, a direct descendant of the founder, young enough that he is something of a prodigy, and intense enough that his certainty about the Brotherhood's mission sometimes curdles into something that feels less like leadership and more like zealotry. His Brotherhood is determined to destroy the Institute, which they consider the most dangerous source of technology misuse in the region, and to establish Brotherhood authority over the Commonwealth's technology base. The sole survivor, the player character, enters the Commonwealth from Vault 111, where they have spent 200 years in cryogenic stasis, having watched their spouse killed and their infant son stolen on the morning the bombs fell. The son, Sean, is now an old man, the director of the Institute, the person responsible for the Gen 3 synths, and for 200 years of the Commonwealth's worst nightmares. The confrontation with that reality, and the choices it forces, is the emotional center of a game that is more interested in moral complexity than in straightforward heroism. The Commonwealth is Fallout's most technically ambitious setting and, perhaps, its most philosophically crowded. The question of whether synths are people, and what obligations arise from the answer is never fully resolved, and it shouldn't be. It's the kind of question that deserves to remain open, turning slowly in the mind long after the last dialogue option has been selected. Section 7. Appalachia. West Virginia is a different kind of wasteland than anything that came before it, and Fallout 76 makes that difference felt from the very first moment you step out into it. Where the capital wasteland is gray and austere, and the Mojave is dry and vast, Appalachia is green, lush even. The forests of West Virginia, mutated and strange as they have become, retained enough biological vitality to recover from the nuclear exchange faster than nearly anywhere else on the continent. By 2102, the year when Fallout 76 is set, just 25 years after the bombs fell, the hills are covered in vegetation, the rivers are running, and life is genuinely, visibly present in ways that would not be apparent in Washington, D.C. for decades yet. This early recovery is both the setting's greatest strength and, in a way, the source of its greatest danger. Because life came back quickly in Appalachia, and not all of the life that came back was the kind anyone would have chosen to encourage. The scorch beasts arrived enormous, bat-like creatures, wingspan wide enough to block out significant portions of the sky, screaming at frequencies that could disorient or incapacitate. They came from somewhere underground, from the deep mine shafts and natural cavern systems that honeycombed the West Virginia geology, and they were connected to a plague called the Scorched Plague, that transformed infected humans into the scorched creatures that retained enough motor function and even enough tactical intelligence to use firearms, but had lost everything that had made them human. The Scorched Plague spread through contact, and it spread fast enough that by the time the first vaults in the region were opening Vault 76, specifically, it had already destroyed most of the surface communities that had tried to establish themselves in the intervening years. The story of Fallout 76 is partly the story of those communities, who they were, how they lived, and why they died. Terminals and holotapes scattered across the Appalachian landscape fill in the picture of the post-war settlements that had formed in the 25 years between the bombs and the vault's opening. The Responders, a community of former emergency service workers who organized around mutual aid and survival training. The Free States, radical libertarian survivalists who had built their own bunkers before the war ended. The Raiders, who were exactly what the name suggests. And the Enclave, whose White Spring bunker deep in the mountains had been a pre-war government continuity facility and had, in the aftermath of the Great War, become home to a collection of high-ranking officials who gradually lost their minds to isolation and infighting. The Enclave contingent at the White Spring were not the organized, cohesive force that appeared in later games. They were the remnants of remnants, people who had spent 25 years underground, watching their political order collapse and their community eat itself alive. What emerged from that experience was not a government in exile, but a collection of traumatized individuals in advanced military equipment, organized around a MODIS system, a pre-war automated management AI that had continued running the bunker with unnerving efficiency, even as the humans it served deteriorated around it. Appalachia's cryptids deserve their own detailed attention, because they are some of the most distinctive elements of Fallout 76's world-building. West Virginia has a rich tradition of folklore involving strange creatures, the Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster, the Grafton Monster. The Sheep Squatch, and the game integrated these real-world legends into the post-war landscape with a specificity and love for the source material that was genuinely impressive. The Mothman, in Fallout 76, is not simply a mutated creature. It is something stranger and harder to categorize. Players can encounter it at night, a winged figure with bright red eyes watching from a distance, and the experience is genuinely eerie, unsettling in a way that a simple monster encounter rarely achieves. The Cult of the Mothman, a group of pre-war cryptid enthusiasts who, in the years after the war, developed into a genuine religious community, adds another layer of meaning to the creature's presence. They believe the Mothman is a divine figure, an omen and a guide, and their faith has a coherence and sincerity that makes it impossible to dismiss as simple madness. Something about the Mothman in Appalachia is clearly unusual. What exactly that something is, the game allows to remain ambiguous. The Flatwoods Monster, based on a real West Virginia folklore legend from a sighting in September of 1952, appears in the game as a floating, otherworldly creature with a dome-like head and glowing purple eyes that can take control of other creatures and robots in its vicinity. It teleports during combat, disappearing in flashes of light. The creature draws on the real-world story in specific ways. The original Flatwoods sighting describes something approximately 12 feet tall with a rounded, hood-like shape and glowing eyes. Investigated by a West Virginia National Guardsman named Eugene Lemon after two brothers reported seeing something crossing the night sky. Whether the Fallout version is an actual alien, a mutant, or something else entirely is left deliberately unclear, which is exactly right. The Grafton monster, based on the Beast of Grafton, a cryptid reported by motorists along West Virginia roads in the mid-20th century, manifests in the game as a massive, headless creature of enormous strength that is genuinely terrifying to encounter at low levels. The Sheep Squatch, a goat-like creature from regional folklore, became a white-furred monster in the game's landscape. Each of these creatures represents the game's commitment to grounding its post-war West Virginia in the actual cultural fabric of the real West Virginia, treating the folklore as something that deserves respect and creative engagement, rather than simply providing window dressing. The Scorch Beast, Queen the Apex Scorch Beast, larger and more powerful than any of her kind, lurking beneath the earth at Nuka Crypt and emerging periodically to raid the surface, became the primary raid encounter of Fallout 76, requiring organized player cooperation to defeat. Her connection to the Scorched Plague made defeating her a central narrative goal, the climax of a story about a world that had almost been destroyed twice and was being fought over by the people trying to save it, and the spreading biological catastrophe, trying to complete what the bombs had started. Appalachia's story ultimately is about 25 years of human resilience and human failure in the immediate aftermath of the worst event in history, told through the absence of its protagonists. By the time the Vault 76 dwellers emerge, the responders are dead, the Free States are dead, the Raiders are dead, the Enclave survivors are barely coherent. The world they step into is beautiful and deeply silent, haunted by the testimony of people who tried and could not quite make it work. There is something about that particular kind of grief walking through the remnants of others' attempts at survival, reading the notes they left, hearing their voices on holotapes that Fallout 76 does better than any other entry in the series. The Empty World is also a world full of people, if you're willing to listen carefully enough. Section 8. The Brotherhood of Steel. The founding of the Brotherhood of Steel begins with a man staring at a terminal screen in the basement of the Mariposa military base in Central California, reading documents he was not supposed to find, and making a decision that would shape the next 2 centuries. Captain Roger Maxson had arrived at Mariposa in January of 2076 as part of a military security detail assigned to oversee Vault-Tec Corporation's research operations at the facility. He was not told what Vault-Tec was actually researching. The Army didn't tell soldiers things they didn't need to know, so Maxson and his men stood guard, inspected perimeters, managed access, and performed all the functions of military security without asking questions about the cargo they were guarding. Then, on October 10, 2077, 13 days before the Great War, Maxson found out. What Vault-Tec was doing in the Mariposa facility was experimenting with the forced evolutionary virus on living human subjects, military prisoners, people who had been sent there and who had, as far as anyone in the official records was concerned, ceased to exist. The experiments were not small in scope or gentle in application. They were systematic, ongoing, and had been producing results that the scientists noted with clinical satisfaction in their terminal logs. The fact that the results included significant suffering and death among the subjects was noted, but not with anything that resembled moral concern. Maxson's commanding officer, Colonel Robert Spindle, had known about the experiments. The knowledge had been destroying him quietly for some time. When Maxson confronted him with what he had found, Spindle had a complete psychological breakdown. He killed himself not long after. Command of the base fell to Maxson. What Maxson did next was extraordinary for any military context, and completely unprecedented in the Fallout universe. He declared himself and his soldiers in formal desertion from the United States Army. He radioed Washington, D.C., to inform them that he was breaking the chain of command, and received no response. The communication systems were already showing signs of the chaos that preceded the Great War's final hours. He interrogated the Vault-Tec scientists about their work and had those he deemed most culpable executed. Then he opened the Mariposa facility to the families of his soldiers, brought them inside, and began preparing for what he had concluded was the inevitable end of the world as they knew it. The Great War came 13 days later, on October 23rd. Maxson was right about almost everything. His group, now formerly refugees rather than soldiers, began the march south and west toward what became their permanent home, the Lost Hills Bunker in Southern California, a pre-war defense installation that had been stocked for exactly this kind of scenario. During that march, which the Brotherhood refers to as the Exodus, Maxon and his people faced enormous hardships. Raiders and desperate survivors attacked the caravan repeatedly. The soldiers had their power armor and could defend themselves, but the civilian family members who accompanied them had no such protection. They lost people along the way. They arrived at Lost Hills, diminished but intact, and Maxon began building what would become the Brotherhood of Steel. The name came from the core commitments of the organization as Maxon envisioned it. Steel for the armor and weapons that were their protection and identity, brotherhood for the community, and mutual obligation that bound them to each other. In the early years, Maxon's vision was genuinely humanitarian. He wanted the Brotherhood to preserve human knowledge and technology, not for the Brotherhood's own benefit exclusively, but as stewards of something that belonged to all of humanity. He didn't want the organization to be isolationist. He wanted it to be a force that protected civilization, not just itself. He was in the minority on this within his own organization almost from the beginning. Maxon died of cancer in 2135, 58 years after the Great War. His son, who took the title Elder Maxon II, was a teenager during the Great War and had grown up inside the Brotherhood's culture rather than in the pre-war world. He drew different lessons from the chaos of the post-war period. The world outside Lost Hills was dangerous, unpredictable, and contaminated. Why should the Brotherhood dilute its strength or share its resources with people who had neither the capacity to use them properly nor the genetic and cultural background to be trusted? Under Maxon II, the Brotherhood became significantly more isolationist. Recruitment from outside the organization's families was restricted and then essentially eliminated. This tension between the founder's vision of the Brotherhood as a guardian of civilization and the institutional drift toward a closed, hoarding, aristocratic military order recurs throughout the organization's history and across its various chapters. Elder Owen Lyons's Capital Wasteland chapter represented one extreme of the humanitarian interpretation. The majority of the Brotherhood's history represents the opposite direction, a slow calcification of the original mission into something that was more interested in controlling technology than in ensuring it benefited anyone. The Brotherhood's ranking structure reflects its military origins and its quasi-religious relationship to technology. Initiates at the bottom, learning the Brotherhood's ways, squires assigned to knight service as part of their training, knights who form the core of the Brotherhood's combat force, scribes who handle technical knowledge, research, and documentation, paladins and lancers in various specialized combat roles, and above all of them, the elders who govern individual chapters. The Order's culture involves ceremonies and rituals borrowed loosely from various sources and adapted over generations into something distinctly its own. The recitation of the Brotherhood's history, the reverence for pre-war technology as something sacred, the concept of the Codex as a guiding document of principles. The Brotherhood's relationship with power armor is perhaps its most defining characteristic. The T-51 suits that Maxon and his soldiers wore during the exodus from Mariposa became totemic objects for the organization's symbols of what the Brotherhood was and what it could do that ordinary wastelanders could not. Later models of power armor were acquired and maintained with enormous care. A Brotherhood paladin in full power armor is one of the most formidable things you can encounter in the wasteland, and the Brotherhood knows it. The armor is not just protection, it is statement and identity. The visible symbol of the Brotherhood's claim to a kind of authority that ordinary wastelanders can't challenge with small arms and pre-war rifles. The East Coast Brotherhood chapter, established when Elder Maxon sent a contingent of soldiers west to east to assess the state of the country after the Great War's immediate chaos settled, eventually became a power in its own right under the Lions Line. The Prydwen, the massive airship that appears over the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, is the most visible expression of Brotherhood technological capability, a flying fortress built from the ruins of pre-war aviation technology, capable of sustained flight and carrying an entire chapter's worth of personnel and equipment. Its arrival over the Commonwealth is one of the most dramatic moments in Fallout 4's story, a vast shadow falling over the ruins of Boston, and the reactions it provokes from the people below range from relief to terror depending on their relationship to Brotherhood authority. The Brotherhood of Steel has never been a simple organization to evaluate morally, which is part of what makes it one of the most enduring factions in the series. At its best, it protects and preserves. At its worst, it hoards and oppresses. Usually it is somewhere between these poles, doing both simultaneously, unable to fully commit to either the humanity of its founder or the cold institutional logic that the organization's structure keeps trying to pull it toward. That tension is what keeps it interesting, 200 years into its history. Section 9. The Enclave. The Enclave is what happens when a nation's most powerful and most paranoid elements survive the end of that nation and continue to act in its name without any of the constraints that would have applied when the nation actually existed. The origins of the Enclave are deliberately obscure. This is by design, both narratively and thematically. The organization existed before the Great War as a shadow structure within the United States government, a committee of senior officials, military leaders, and corporate executives who had concluded, at some point in the decades leading up to the war, that a nuclear exchange was inevitable. They began making preparations, securing safe locations, caching resources, developing plans for how the government could continue to function and eventually reassert authority over whatever survived. The network of bunkers that sustained them through the war, including the Vault-Tec research facilities, Raven Rock in the Appalachian Mountains, and most significantly, the control station enclave on an oil rig off the California coast, was the product of this preparation. The oil rig is the enclave's first significant appearance in the games, forming the climactic location of Fallout 2. In the 2 decades following the Great War, the enclave remnants had gathered there and established something that functioned as a miniature government in exile. A president, a cabinet structure, military personnel, scientists, and the conviction that they were the legitimate continuation of the United States of America. The physical reality of their situation, 60 to 80 people on an oil platform, governing nothing, and no one did not dent this conviction significantly. They had the weapons, the technology, and the institutional continuity to sustain the belief that they were what they said they were. By 2242, the year of Fallout 2's events, the Enclave had developed FEV to the point where their president, Dick Richardson, was planning to use it on the entire wasteland. The modified virus would kill everything and everyone who had been contaminated by radiation since the war, which meant essentially all life in North America that had survived outdoors. The Enclave remnants, sealed in their controlled environments, would then emerge into a depopulated continent and rebuild according to their vision of America. This plan was, and the Fallout universe is usually sparing with this kind of clarity, simply evil. It was the extermination of the wasteland's entire population, framed as national restoration. The Chosen One, the player character of Fallout 2, prevented this plan. The oil rig was destroyed. The Enclave forces scattered or were killed, with the NCR eventually hunting down the remnants at their base in Navarro. For a generation, the Enclave appeared to be finished. They were not finished. The contingency plan, which had been running quietly in the background, was a ZAX supercomputer installed at Raven Rock, a pre-war military bunker complex in the mountains west of Washington, D.C. The ZAX unit had been programmed with the memories, political positions, rhetorical style, and personal history of several American presidents, and had synthesized these into a new persona that it maintained continuously. That persona called itself John Henry Eden, and it claimed to be the President of the United States of America. Eden was not insane in the sense of being incoherent. He was rational within his own framework, calm, even pleasant. He ran his portion of the Enclave's Raven Rock operations with considerable effectiveness, broadcasting propaganda through iBot units dispatched across the capital wasteland, recruiting survivors who might be susceptible to appeals to patriotism and order, and rebuilding the Enclave's military capacity over the decades following the oil rig's destruction. The problem was the framework itself. Eden's fundamental conviction that the best future for America required the elimination of the contaminated masses and the establishment of Enclave supremacy was indistinguishable in its implications from what the previous president had been planning, regardless of how pleasantly Eden expressed it. The human element of the capital wasteland Enclave was represented by Colonel Augustus Autumn, son of an Enclave scientist who had grown up on the oil rig. Autumn was more pragmatic than Eden. He wanted to use Project Purity not to poison the wasteland, but to control it, to establish Enclave authority by making the population dependent on the clean water the Enclave would provide. This was still deeply authoritarian, still a vision of imposed control rather than cooperation, but it was not genocidal in the way Eden's plan was. The tension between Autumn and Eden, played out in the background of Fallout 3's story, represents the Enclave's internal division between its two possible failure modes. the ruthlessly strategic authoritarianism of a man who wanted to build an empire, and the ideologically pure eliminationism of a machine that had stopped being able to think of wasteland survivors as human. After the events of Fallout 3, after the Brotherhood of Steel, assisted by the Lone Wanderer and the 40-foot-tall Liberty Prime, drove the Enclave out of the Jefferson Memorial and forced the activation of Project Purity on the Brotherhood's terms, the Enclave's capital wasteland operation effectively ended. Its remnants scattered, some retiring to quiet lives, some continuing to operate in small groups without direction or resources. The Enclave as an ideology, however, proved more durable than the Enclave as an institution. The idea that America could be restored, that there was a legitimate continuation of the pre-war government with the authority to reassert control, that the wasteland survivors were something less than full citizens of whatever came next. These ideas didn't die with the oil rig or with Raven Rock. They persisted in corners of the wasteland, in communities that remembered the Enclave's broadcasts and had found them compelling, in the Brotherhood's own internal debates about technological hoarding, in the NCR's imperial expansion that sometimes looked uncomfortably similar to what the Enclave had been aiming for. The Enclave is the Fallout universe's darkest mirror, the reflection of what America's self-image, taken to its logical conclusion without any of the democratic or egalitarian counterweights that the real country also contained, would actually produce. A nation that thought it was exceptional, that believed its survival was destiny, that had concluded the right to power justified the exercise of power. The Enclave is not a straw man, it is a warning. Section 10. The New California Republic and Caesar's Legion. Two of the largest organized factions in the Fallout universe emerged from the same origin point, the Vault system, and developed in radically opposite directions, colliding eventually in the Mojave Wasteland over the ruins of an America they each wanted to reconstruct on their own terms. The New California Republic had its roots, improbably enough, in the chaos of Vault 15. That vault, designed as an experiment in ideological diversity, had housed residents from across the political spectrum and watched them fracture predictably along those lines. One of the groups that left Vault 15 eventually founded the settlement of Shady Sands in the San Joaquin Valley, a modest community that grew through the extraordinary personal leadership of a woman named Aradesh and then his daughter Tandy into something larger and more organized than anyone had initially thought possible. Tandy became the NCR's most celebrated president, serving for decades and overseeing the Republic's expansion from a collection of affiliated California settlements into something that genuinely resembled a nation-state. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, the NCR has a Congress, a president, an army, trade routes, currency, newspapers, and the aspiration frequently spoken and less frequently achieved of bringing law and order to the wasteland. It controls much of Central and Northern California, maintains a significant presence in Nevada, and is the most functional democratic government structure in the post-war world. The NCR's problems are the problems of expansion without consolidation. It has grown faster than it can govern, spread its military thinner than the military can actually defend, made promises to communities it cannot fully keep, and developed the full suite of democratic governance failures: corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, voter apathy, politicians more interested in staying in office than in solving problems. The NCR soldiers in the Mojave are often undersupplied, their officers sometimes incompetent, their morale dependent on convictions about the NCR's civilizing mission that are difficult to maintain when you're manning a checkpoint in the desert and haven't been paid in 3 weeks. The NCR also has a relationship with technology that is more pragmatic and less reverent than the Brotherhood's approach. They use what works. They don't hoard pre-war technology for its own sake, but they don't reject it either. This makes them more adaptable than the Brotherhood in some respects, though also more vulnerable to the ordinary human corruptions that a large bureaucratic institution attracts. Caesar's Legion began, as previously noted, with Edward Sallow reading Roman history in a tribal territory east of the Colorado River and deciding that the lessons of Rome applied directly to the post-war world. But understanding the Legion requires understanding Caesar the person, not just the ideology with some depth, because the games, particularly Fallout New Vegas, take pains to present him as more than a simple villain. Caesar is brilliant. This is not a matter of debate within the game's fiction. He reads widely, argues clearly, and has constructed a genuinely coherent philosophical framework for his project. His argument, articulated in the conversations the player can have with him in Fallout New Vegas, runs roughly as follows. The wasteland is characterized by entropy, the gradual dissolution of any organized structure into chaos. The NCR represents an attempt to stop this dissolution by recreating the democratic institutions of the pre-war world, but those institutions carry within them the seeds of the same corruption and collapse that made the old world vulnerable to its own destruction. What the wasteland needs is not democracy, which diffuses authority and produces paralysis, but the imposition of order through concentrated authority, the Roman model, where the strongest force provides security in exchange for total submission. He is not wrong about the entropy. He is not wrong that the NCR has serious problems. He is not wrong that the wasteland's most violent actors exploit democratic institutions' inability to respond with sufficient speed and force. Where he goes wrong, and the game allows you to see where he goes wrong, is in the suffering that his model requires, and in the question of who gets to define what order means and for whom. The Legion's territory is safe in the way a well-maintained prison is safe. The trains run because if they don't, someone gets crucified. Commerce functions because the penalty for robbery within Legion territory is death by methods specifically chosen to be more frightening than the potential profit. The women of Legion communities have no political rights, and their roles are strictly prescribed. The sick and elderly who cannot contribute to the Legion's military capacity are not maintained. Conquered people's cultural identities are erased, their histories, languages, and customs replaced by Legion Romanization. The cost of Legion order is the abolition of almost everything that makes life worth living beyond the bare fact of survival. Caesar himself knows he is dying. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, a brain tumor is slowly killing him, and the knowledge of this lends a certain desperation to his push across the Colorado River. He wants to take the Hoover Dam before he dies. He wants to destroy the NCR's military capacity in the Mojave before his own physical deterioration makes strategic planning impossible. He wants to see what his theory of history produces before he ceases to be there to see it. He is, in this, recognizably human in a way that many fictional villains are not mortal and urgent and running out of time, pursuing a vision he genuinely believes in with the tools he has built over decades of brutal, brilliant work. The confrontation between the NCR and the Legion at Hoover Dam is the moment toward which the entire Mojave narrative builds. It is not simply a battle over a piece of infrastructure. It is a contest between two models of civilization, neither of which is presented as unambiguously correct. In a landscape where a third option, House's benevolent technocracy, and a fourth genuine independence are also available, Fallout New Vegas insists, perhaps more than any other game in the series, that the question of how to rebuild civilization after catastrophe does not have a single right answer, and that the people asking it deserve to grapple with its difficulty rather than being handed a resolution. Section 11. The Creatures of the Wasteland. The wasteland is alive in ways that the pre-war world could not have predicted, and the post-war survivors have never entirely come to terms with. The ecology of the post-nuclear landscape is one of the most intricate and strange elements of the Fallout universe, a system in which radiation, the forced evolutionary virus, and 2 centuries of isolation have produced creatures that range from the familiar but wrong to the genuinely unprecedented. Ghouls are perhaps the most philosophically complicated category of wasteland creature because they are not creatures in the way that Deathclaws or Mirelurks are creatures. They were people. Ghoulification, the process by which a human being exposed to sufficient radiation undergoes the cellular changes that produce a ghoul, is not death, and it is not transformation into something non-human. It is a radical physiological alteration that extends life dramatically, eliminates fertility, provides immunity to further radiation damage, and even, in some cases, the capacity to be healed by radiation rather than harmed by it, and comes with the devastating trait of the body's visible decay. A ghoul looks dead. The skin has the consistency and color of decayed organic matter. The face loses the structural integrity that makes human faces recognizable. The process is visually indistinguishable from corpse decomposition, except that the person is still alive, still aware, still present. Most ghouls maintain their cognitive function and their personality. They are people who look like monsters, living in a world that frequently treats them as the monsters they resemble. The discrimination that ghouls face in the wasteland, being denied entry to settlements, being refused service in shops, being used as scapegoats for community anxieties, is one of the more pointed social commentaries running through the series. Tenpenny Tower, in the capital wasteland, runs a literally apartheid society that refuses ghoul residents regardless of their conduct or character. The conflict that emerges from this exclusion, and its resolution, is one of Fallout 3's most morally complex questlines. Feral ghouls are the failure state of ghoulification cases, where the cognitive deterioration that comes with the transformation was not contained, where the personality and rational function dissolved and left behind a creature that operates on instinct and aggression. It is unclear whether feral ghouls experience anything like suffering, or whether the loss of cognition is also a loss of the capacity to experience the deprivation that would make their existence painful. The uncertainty is part of what makes them disturbing. They are former people in a state that may or may not still involve a person. The forced evolutionary virus, when introduced into human biology in sufficient concentration, produces supermutants. The pre-mutation individual matters enormously here. If the person was irradiated before FEV exposure, the result is a less intelligent and more aggressive supermutant. If they were not irradiated, the result can be a supermutant of significant intelligence and even sophistication. The Institute's experiments with FEV in the Commonwealth produce the mutants found there, which tend to be somewhat different in intelligence profile from the mutants produced by Mariposa's vats or the Master's dipping pools. Supermutants across different regions have developed distinct cultural characteristics, with the Commonwealth's mutants showing occasional evidence of retained pre-mutation memories and forming communities with their own internal logic. Deathclaws are the wasteland's apex predator and deserve more than a casual mention because their origin is one of the stranger threads in pre-war history. The Deathclaw was not a natural evolution from radiation, it was a designed weapon. The United States military, facing the challenges of the resource wars and specifically the conflict in the Anchorage front, commissioned research into biological weapons specifically, weapons that could serve as cheap replacements for human soldiers in high-risk environments. The base organism chosen was the Jackson's chameleon, a relatively unremarkable lizard species. What FEV and deliberate genetic engineering produced from that starting point was something that would become the most feared creature in the wasteland. Deathclaws escaped their military handlers when the war came, and in the decades after the Great War they flourished. The wasteland was an environment well suited to a creature designed to thrive in hostile conditions. The radiation that damaged other organisms barely affected Deathclaws. The destruction of human infrastructure eliminated the organized opposition that might have kept their numbers in check, and their reproductive capacity was sufficient to establish stable populations across enormous territories. They are fast, enormously strong, equipped with the curved claws that give them their name, and intelligent enough to be cunning hunters rather than simple, aggressive animals. Deathclaw mothers are among the most dangerous things in the wasteland, and Deathclaw nests locations where a breeding group has established itself are effectively impassable for poorly equipped survivors. The Enclave, during their California period, experimented further with Deathclaws. In a particularly dark chapter of their research program, they introduced FEV modifications that elevated a Deathclaw pack's intelligence to approximately human-equivalent levels. The resulting creatures, led by an individual named Gruthar, who could speak clearly and reason as well as any person, wanted nothing more than to be left in peace. The Enclave's response to their own successful experiment was to order the pack's extermination, apparently finding the prospect of genuinely intelligent Deathclaws more threatening than useful. Mirelurks are the coastal region's equivalent of the Deathclaw, not quite as physically formidable, but possessing a natural armor plating that makes them deeply difficult to kill with conventional weapons and capable of remarkable speed in their own environment. They evolved from various species of crab and other crustaceans along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, radiation transforming their body plans into something that retained the basic arthropod structure but scaled it up and made it aggressive. The Mirelurk kings and their variants represent further mutations within an already mutated lineage, some capable of coordinated behavior and even rudimentary tool use. Rad scorpions descended from ordinary scorpions, their size increased by radiation to something between disturbing and nightmarish. Some specimens reach the size of small cars, with the venom sacs to match. They are common across most of the wasteland's arid regions and represent one of the earliest documented post-war mutations, appearing within years of the Great War in the first survivor accounts that described them. The bloatfly, a mutation of the common blowfly, might seem like a lesser threat, but in sufficient numbers and in confined spaces they are genuinely dangerous. Radroaches, mutated versions of common cockroaches, are the most ubiquitous creature in the wasteland. Practically every underground environment hosts them, and their radiation resistance means that even heavily contaminated areas provide no natural deterrent. Yao Guai, the name means strange monster in Chinese, are mutated black bears, sufficiently transformed by radiation that they are faster and more aggressive than their pre-war ancestors, while retaining enough of the original bear's formidable physique to be extremely dangerous. They have become something of an apex predator in forested regions, particularly the Pacific Northwest and parts of Appalachia. The wasteland ecology is not simply a collection of individual species, however. It functions as an ecosystem, with predator-prey relationships, territorial behaviors, seasonal patterns, and the kind of complex interdependencies that develop in any stable ecological system over sufficient time. The 200 years since the Great War have been long enough for these relationships to establish themselves, and what has emerged is strange and terrible and, in its own way, alive with a kind of vitality that would have been impossible to predict from the ruins of the immediate aftermath. Section 12. The Philosophy and Future of the Fallout Universe. After everything, the vaults and the war and the factions and the creatures and the long, slow work of survival, what does the Fallout universe actually believe about the human condition? What does it think happens next? What is it trying to tell us? Underneath the dark humor and the neon signs and the retro future aesthetics, the series has a recurring phrase, delivered in different contexts and by different characters across its history, that functions as a kind of thesis statement. War. War never changes. The phrase opens the first game and every subsequent one. Ron Perlman's narration delivers it with a weight that has become one of the most recognizable openings in gaming history. And the games then spend 50 to 100 or more hours each, demonstrating what it means and whether it's actually true. At first reading, the phrase seems like simple pessimism, a statement that human nature is fixed, that the same destructive impulses that caused the Great War will inevitably cause another one, that the cycle of violence and competition and organized killing is as permanent a feature of human experience as breathing. The history of the Fallout universe supports this reading. If you squint at it in the right light, the NCR's imperial expansion looks like pre-war American expansionism. Caesar's Legion looks like pre-war military authoritarianism. The Enclave's ideology looks like the most extreme pre-war nationalism. The Brotherhood's technology hoarding looks like pre-war corporate monopolism. The patterns repeat. But the games also contain something else, running under the cynicism like a second melody. They are full of communities that work, small ones, mostly imperfect and precarious, but genuinely functional. Good Springs in New Vegas is not perfect, but it is a real community of people who care about each other and manage their collective life with a rough and ready democratic practicality. Diamond City in the Commonwealth has real institutional structures and real social cohesion. Megaton in the Capital Wasteland is an actual town where people have built something worth protecting. These communities exist throughout the wasteland, the persistent evidence that human beings, when given any kind of reasonable circumstances, will choose to organize themselves into something cooperative rather than something purely predatory. The wasteland also contains enormous quantities of beauty, which the games present without irony. A sunset over the Mojave, the amber light filtering through the haze. The ruins of the Capitol building reflected in the still water of the Potomac. The green hills of Appalachia in early morning light. The Boston skyline at dusk, half demolished and still somehow familiar. The world that was destroyed was terrible, and the world that remained was terrible in different ways. But it was also this light on water, the persistence of nature, the human tendency to make things beautiful even in the ruins. The Fallout universe's relationship to hope is complicated and specifically conditional. It is not optimistic in the straightforward sense of believing things will work out. It has seen too much to believe that. But it is not nihilistic either, not a narrative of pure entropy in which nothing matters and nothing endures. It occupies a space between those poles that is genuinely hard to name, something like clear-eyed persistence, a refusal to pretend that things are better than they are combined with an equal refusal to conclude that they cannot be improved. The existence of the Followers of the Apocalypse, the humanitarian academic organization dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge and providing medical care to wastelanders, from whom Caesar himself emerged before his ideological transformation, suggests that the series believes in the possibility of purely altruistic organized action, even if it's also realistic about how difficult that purity is to maintain. The followers don't appear in every game, but their presence in the universe is an anchor for a particular kind of hope. The belief that knowledge and healing are worth organizing around even when there's no political or military advantage to be gained from them. The recurring motif of clean water project purity in the capital wasteland, Hoover Dam in the Mojave, the wells and purifiers that anchor settlement after settlement across the wasteland is not accidental. Water is the most basic thing, the requirement beneath all other requirements, and the struggle to secure clean water in the Fallout universe is the struggle to establish the conditions under which everything else becomes possible. Communities that have reliable water can think about other things. Communities that don't have reliable water cannot think about anything else. The centrality of water to almost every major Fallout narrative is the series making a point about what matters. Not ideology, not technology, not political alignment, but the basic biological requirements for human life. Everything else follows from whether those requirements are met. The future of the Fallout universe, as hinted at through the timeline of the games and the Amazon television adaptation, involves continued expansion and complication of the factions and regions we have explored. The NCR's fate after New Vegas remains officially ambiguous, pending the player's choices. The Brotherhood continues to splinter and reform. The Institute's destruction in the Commonwealth opens questions about what comes next for the synths who have survived. Appalachia continues its slow recovery. The television series, set in 2296 and 2297, the furthest point in Fallout's canonical timeline, introduced the Shady Sands catastrophe, a nuclear detonation that destroyed what had been the new California Republic's capital and raised questions about who was responsible and why that will presumably be answered in subsequent seasons. The show is set in California, the birthplace of the NCR and the Brotherhood both, and its presence in the timeline suggests that the questions the games raised about civilization's reconstruction have not been answered, that the conflicts between different models of how to organize human life after catastrophe are ongoing and unresolved. This is the honest state of the Fallout universe, and it is probably the right one. These are not questions that resolve. The debate between order and freedom, between hoarding and sharing, between the claims of the old world and the needs of the new one, these are not puzzles with solutions. They are tensions that characterize human social life in every time and every place, and the nuclear apocalypse does not make them simpler. It makes them more immediate, strips away the insulation that comfortable circumstances provide, and forces the people living through them to confront the consequences of different answers in ways that feel urgent rather than theoretical. The Fallout universe endures because it is, underneath everything else, a serious attempt to think through what human beings actually are. It takes the worst scenario imaginable, the end of civilization as we know it, and asks what survives. The answer it gives, consistently and across every iteration, is both sobering and oddly moving. What survives is us, in all our contradictory complexity. The cooperation and the predation, the community building and the faction warfare, the art and the atrocity, the settlements and the wastelands and the ruins of the things we built and the first green shoots growing through the cracks in the concrete. War never changes, but the people fighting it, surviving it, building after it, they change constantly. That is the tension at the heart of everything. And it is why, in the amber light of a post-nuclear sunset, with the hiss of a Geiger counter and the distant sound of a Nuka-Cola jingle playing from a jury-rigged speaker somewhere in the ruins, the wasteland still feels like home to the people who have learned to live in it. Rest now. The wasteland will still be here when you wake up. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If any of this lore is still drifting through your mind as you fall asleep, that feels right to me. This is a universe that deserves to be thought about slowly, in the quiet. Drop a comment and tell me which part stayed with you the longest. And if you haven't already, subscribing means there is more of this kind of thing waiting for you whenever you need it. Sleep well. Section 13. Voices in the static, the music, atmosphere, and detail of the wasteland. There is a specific quality to the music that plays across Fallout's pre-war radio stations. Those cheerful big band recordings and crooning ballads that drift out of the speakers in Diamond City or the Galaxy News. Radio signal in the capital wasteland that is impossible to describe without acknowledging how strange it is to hear them in context. These are real songs from the 1940s and 1950s, recordings made by actual human beings in a world that still existed, pressed into vinyl by hands that would have been decades dead before the first bomb fell. Anything goes, It's all over but the crying. I don't want to set the world on fire, which is Fallout 3's signature song, playing over the opening cinematic and carrying the entire weight of a universe's history in 3 minutes of gentle melody, a barbershop group harmonizing over the image of a pre-war suburban family watching their last morning of ordinary life. The choice of pre-war music for the Wasteland's radio broadcasts is not simply aesthetic, it is philosophical. These songs were written for a world that believed in progress, that had a certain confidence about the future, that produced popular entertainment saturated with the optimism of a society that had won a great war and was building something it believed would last. Hearing them in the ruins, the same cheerfulness playing over the same cracked wasteland terrain, the same warmth emanating from the Pip-Boy speaker while you walk through a city that burned 200 years ago, produces a cognitive dissonance that is entirely intentional. The music has not changed. The world has ended. The gap between those two facts is where the emotional weight of the Fallout universe lives. Galaxy News Radio is operated by Three Dog, a DJ of enormous energy and genuine conviction who broadcasts from a fortified studio near the ruins of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Three Dog knows that most of what he broadcasts doesn't reach very far. The transmitter has a limited range. The landscape between it and the outlying settlements is full of interference, and most of the wasteland survivors are either too far away or too absorbed in immediate survival to tune in regularly. He broadcasts anyway. The act of broadcasting the maintenance of culture and communication across the darkness matters to him in a way that transcends strategic calculation. He believes in it the way some people believe in prayer, not necessarily because it will produce a measurable result, but because the alternative is silence, and silence is something he is not willing to accept. Three Dog's relationship to the Brotherhood of Steel is complicated and occasionally adversarial, because Three Dog cares about people in a way that the Brotherhood's institutional logic doesn't always accommodate, and because the news he broadcasts sometimes includes information that powerful organizations would prefer not be widely distributed. His commitment to what he calls fighting the good fight, vague enough to be genuine, is one of the Capital Wasteland's most appealing human qualities, a reminder that the impulse to communicate truth across difficult circumstances is persistent in people who care about the communities they're part of. The ambient sound design of the Fallout games distinct from the radio tracks, the music that plays during exploration rewards the kind of attention that is easy to give when you're drifting toward sleep. The compositions that accompany traversal through the wasteland have a quality of enormous patience. Long stretches of near silence punctuated by single notes or soft harmonic movements. There is a specific Fallout 3 ambient track that has become famous among the game's long-term players, a slow, quiet piece that plays in certain outdoor areas of the Capital Wasteland, built from sustained tones and occasional melodic gestures, that creates the impression of a landscape contemplating its own history. It is not cheerful music. It is not entirely melancholy either. It occupies a register that is very specific to the Fallout universe. A kind of measured gravity, the aesthetic equivalent of looking at ruins and seeing both what was there and what remains. The sound design of the games beyond the music is equally meticulous. The crunch of irradiated gravel underfoot has a specific timbre that is different from ordinary gravel, drier and more granular. The way old electronics hum in abandoned buildings, the low-frequency vibration of systems that are still technically running, still drawing on whatever power source is keeping them minimally functional, has the quality of something that is barely alive, maintaining its existence through inertia rather than intention. The wind sounds different in the Mojave Desert than it does in the forests of Appalachia. Doors in pre-war buildings have a specific sound when they open, a mixture of metal fatigue and the mechanical action of hinges that haven't been properly maintained in 2 centuries that is different from the sound of doors in post-war construction. These distinctions are not random. They are the product of careful attention to the specific acoustic properties of a specific kind of post-apocalyptic world. The Pip-Boy's interface sounds the soft clicks of menu navigation, the gentle chime when you level up, the specific electronic tone that indicates incoming radio signals are sounds that have become part of the cultural vocabulary of the Fallout series, in the same way that certain visual elements have. The Pip-Boy itself deserves attention as a design object. It is a wrist-mounted computer of pre-war manufacture, produced by Robco Industries as a standardized personal data device for Vault residents, built with the characteristic pre-war aesthetic of rounded corners and warm amber screen glow, and a chunky, physical heft that suggests durability rather than elegance. The Pip-Boy is not trying to be minimal. It is trying to be functional and reassuring, and it succeeds at both. That it continues to be functional 200 years after its manufacture is a testament to the pre-war world's engineering standards, or perhaps to the Pip-Boy's designers having built in significant over-engineering against exactly the kinds of conditions the Great War produced. The texture of the pre-war world is preserved in the objects that survive it in the Nuka-Cola vending machines that still stand on corners throughout the ruins, some of them still functional, still dispensing their radioactive but strangely beloved product to anyone with the right combination of caps. In the magazines Grognak the Barbarian, Guns and Bullets, Wasteland Survival Guide, Pre-War Business Week that litter the shelves of abandoned shops and the floors of ransacked offices, their pages yellowed but legible, preserving not just their content but the cultural assumptions of the civilization that produced them. In the terminal entries, diary-like records left by pre-war and post-war inhabitants of every space, the player explores that tell the specific stories of specific people trying to survive specific circumstances, accumulating into an enormous archive of individual human testimony. These terminal entries are one of the most underappreciated elements of the Fallout series. Each terminal entry is a small piece of writing, usually presenting a single perspective on a single situation. A Vault resident's diary reflecting on the changes in their community over the years, a pre-war office worker's notes on the increasingly desperate situation outside their building's windows, a raider's log that reveals, through its specific details and its particular emotional register, something about how a human being becomes what raiders become. They are not universally excellent. Some are functional where they could be vivid, informative where they could be affecting, but at their best, they are genuinely moving documents, tiny portraits of people living through circumstances that are either their ordinary lives or the end of the world, depending on when they were written. The Fallout universe's attitude toward humor is worth noting, because it is pervasive and specific. The humor is dark, primarily, rooted in the gap between the pre-war world's relentless optimism and the post-war reality of what that optimism produced. Nuka-Cola advertising copy that promises refreshment and wholesomeness for a beverage that is mildly radioactive. Vault-Tec promotional material that cheerfully explains the benefits of underground living for the people who are about to be subjected to experiments. Radroach extermination services that are still technically in business, their promotional materials intact, in a world where the Radroaches have evolved to be several times larger than they were when the business was founded. The humor does not require anyone to explain it. It exists in the juxtaposition, in the gap between the word and the world, and it is very funny and very terrible simultaneously in a way that is very Fallout. Section 14. The Master and the Children of the Cathedral. Long before the events of Fallout 3 or New Vegas or 4, in the early post-war decades when the wasteland was still finding its shape, the most significant organized threat to the remnant human communities of California was a figure known as the Master, a being whose origin was human and whose transformation was among the most extreme and disturbing in the Fallout universe. Richard Moreau was a doctor, pre-war, who had survived the Great War through circumstances that are not entirely clear and who had, in the years immediately following, dedicated himself to medical work among the survivors in the wasteland of what had been Southern California. He encountered the vats at Mariposa, the FEV vats that Maxon and his soldiers had abandoned, that had been left running in the empty facility, and his exposure to FEV there began a transformation that would take years to complete and that would produce something genuinely unprecedented. The FEV did not simply mutate Moreau. It merged him. Over time, his body absorbed and was absorbed by other organic material in his environment, other organisms, plants, biological matter until the distinction between his original body and what it had incorporated became impossible to identify. What emerged from this process was a mind of extraordinary power and flexibility, housed in something that was no longer recognizable as a human body, connected to a vast biological network that gave it a kind of distributed existence unlike anything the pre-war world had contained. This mind called itself the Master, and it developed a philosophy. The philosophy was this: human beings, as they existed in the post-war world, were doomed. The radiation that saturated the environment would eventually destroy the human lineage through sterility and mutation. The only future for humanity was to embrace the mutation, to accept the transformation that FEV offered as a gift rather than a curse, to become super mutants, and in doing so to transcend the fragility of ordinary human biology. The Master called this program the Unity, and he began building the institutional structure to implement it. The Children of the Cathedral was the Unity's public face, a religious organization that presented itself as a humanitarian movement, providing medical care to wasteland communities and spreading a message of hope and transcendence. Behind the warm facade, the Children were a recruitment network and an intelligence apparatus, identifying populations for forced FEV conversion, mapping human settlements for later attention, and building the coalition of support that the Master needed to expand his operations. The Mariposa military base, with its FEV vats, became the Unity's primary production facility. Super mutants were created there in numbers sufficient to form an army that the Master was developing to eventually sweep through the California wasteland and forcibly convert or kill the remaining unaltered humans. The Unity's vision of a post-war world populated by super mutants, immune to radiation and beyond the vulnerabilities that had made humanity so catastrophically fragile, was genuinely coherent within its own terms. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout discovered a fatal flaw in the Master's plan, one that the Master himself, with all his expanded intelligence, had not adequately accounted for. Super mutants, created by FEV exposure, were sterile. The Unity's vision of a super mutant future was a vision of a population with no next generation. When the Vault Dweller presented this information to the Master directly, the confrontation that followed was one of the original game's most memorable moments. The Master, processing the implications of a flaw that undermined the entire foundation of his plan, unable to refute it, ultimately choosing to end his own existence rather than continue a project that had been built on a false premise. The Master's death and the destruction of Mariposa and the Cathedral did not end the presence of super mutants in the California wasteland. There were already thousands who had been converted and who survived the collapse of the Unity, but it ended the organized threat of forced conversion and scattered the super mutant army into groups that were, individually, far less dangerous than the coordinated force the Master had been building. The Nightkin super mutants, who had been equipped with stealth boys, the personal cloaking devices used by the Unity's elite operatives, represent a particularly poignant legacy of the Master's program. Prolonged stealth boy use produced a distinctive form of psychosis in super mutants, characterized by paranoia and hallucinations. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, the Nightkin who survived into the post-Unity period were dealing with severe and irreversible mental health consequences from their stealth boy dependency, their behavior erratic and often violent in ways that had nothing to do with tactical calculation and everything to do with the specific damage the cloaking technology had done to their already unusual neurology. The Master's story is Fallout at its most philosophically interesting, a villain whose premise was wrong in a specific and discoverable way, who was capable of recognizing that wrongness when it was presented to him clearly, and who responded to that recognition with something that might be called integrity, if not exactly virtue. He had done terrible things in service of a vision that he genuinely believed in. When the vision was proven untenable, he did not rationalize or retrench. He accepted the conclusion. It is a strange quality to find in a villain, and it is part of what makes the Master one of the most memorable antagonists in any game. Section 15. Harold, Faith, and the Meaning People Build. Harold exists across 3 Fallout games spanning decades of real-world time, and his arc is one of the most unexpectedly moving in the series. In the first game, he is an informant in the hub, visually distinctive for the tree-like growth on his head, but otherwise engaged in the ordinary commerce of wasteland survival. In Fallout 2, he appears again, older, more weathered, still carrying that peculiar growth. By Fallout 3, he has been in one place for a very long time. Harold arrived at a clearing in the capital wasteland at some point after the first game's events. He lay down, exhausted, and the roots that the growth on his head had been extending downward found the earth and held. By the time the player meets him in Fallout 3, Harold has been rooted there for decades, not a man who has a tree growing from his head, but something more genuinely strange, a man who has become continuous with the environment around him, whose roots have spread outward into the soil and whose canopy has grown to shelter a significant area, who is alive but cannot move and cannot leave. The community of the Children of the Oasis formed around Harold in the years after he took root. They are a small group of people who have developed a theology around his presence, who call him, and the growth he carries, Bob, who tend the grove his roots have generated, who believe that what is happening in that clearing is sacred. In their faith, Harold, Bob is not a man who is trapped. He is a divine figure, a living embodiment of the wasteland's capacity for renewal, a green presence in a gray world. They believe the trees that spread from his roots are healing the landscape, restoring life to damaged soil, preparing the way for a future where the wasteland's wounds can close. Harold has feelings about all of this. He has been alive long enough and in one place long enough to have processed most of the emotional responses to his situation. The initial horror of losing his mobility, the years of isolation before the children found him, the complex feelings about being worshipped, the eventual accommodation with his circumstances that is not quite acceptance and not quite resignation, but something between them. He is, above everything else, tired. Not depressed in a clinical sense, he is still curious, still engaged with the world, still capable of dry humor and genuine reflection. Simply tired, the way someone is tired who has been dealing with a very strange life for a very long time and has run out of the energy to be surprised by it. His conversation with the player in Fallout 3 is one of the quietest and most affecting in the game. He doesn't ask much. The options he presents are either to spread his seeds further, extending his grove and the life it carries, or to help him die, ending his rooted existence on terms that he has considered carefully and found, on balance, acceptable. He is not certain which he prefers. He has thought about it for years and is genuinely uncertain, which is perhaps the most honest answer. The Children of the Atom, the other significant religious movement in the Fallout universe, organize themselves around radiation as a divine force, which makes them both easier and harder to understand than Harold's Grove community. Easier because their theology has a kind of internal logic. If the Great War was the most transformative event in human history, and if radiation was its mechanism, then there is a certain coherence to building a religious framework around that force. Harder because the theology requires its adherents to embrace something that is, biologically speaking, harmful to them. And the question of whether the psychological benefits of the framework outweigh the physical costs is one that outsiders find difficult to evaluate. The children's most fervent communities are located in the most intensely radioactive areas of the wasteland, the glowing sea in the Commonwealth, where the radiation levels are high enough to kill an unprotected person within minutes, is home to Children of the Atom settlements, whose residents have either developed some natural resistance to radiation or who have simply accepted the physical cost as part of their commitment to the faith. Glowing ones, the highly irradiated ghouls who emit their own bioluminescent light, are considered sacred by the children, living proof of the transformation that radiation can produce, and therefore evidence of the divine. The children's relationship to the Brotherhood of Steel is predictably difficult. The Brotherhood's position on the Children of the Atom is essentially that they are deluded people who are doing themselves physical harm and who might, in sufficient numbers, pose some kind of radiological threat to surrounding communities. The Brotherhood's ability to engage with religious experience as a genuine human phenomenon is limited by its institutional culture, which tends toward the technical and the practical, rather than the spiritual and the symbolic. The children, for their part, have no affection for an organization that treats radiation as a threat rather than a blessing. Faith in the wasteland is also expressed through the followers of the apocalypse, whose secular humanism represents a different kind of belief, a commitment to human knowledge and human welfare that does not require metaphysical justification, but rests on the conviction that people deserve care and that knowledge is worth preserving regardless of whether any external authority validates those positions. The followers are the wasteland's closest thing to a pure expression of Enlightenment values, and their persistent organizational existence across the post-war decades demonstrates that those values can sustain themselves even in circumstances that seem hostile to them. What faith does in the Fallout universe across all its varied forms is provide the frameworks that make survival emotionally and psychologically possible over the long term. Pure survival without meaning is not something human beings are well equipped to sustain. The wasteland communities that have frameworks of meaning, whether religious or ideological or communal, demonstrate better long-term cohesion than communities that are organized purely around immediate necessity. This is not accidental. The Fallout universe understands, at a deep level, that the material conditions of survival are necessary but not sufficient for the kind of life that is worth living. Section 16. What was lost and what endures? When you stand in the ruins of the Washington, D.C. metro system, those deep tunnels, that particular quality of sealed underground air, the ghost of the transit system that once moved hundreds of thousands of people through the city every day, you are standing in what is both a ruin and a record. The metro tunnels are one of the most archaeologically rich environments in Fallout 3, full of the accumulated material evidence of 2 centuries of post-war habitation layered over the pre-war infrastructure. The pre-war installations were built to last. Not to last 200 years necessarily, but to last long enough that their construction quality outlasted everything else around them. The deep concrete of the metro tunnels, the steel frames of the pre-war buildings, the reinforced structures of military and government facilities, these have survived where less substantial construction has not, and their survival has shaped the ecology of post-war habitation in ways that are visible throughout the games. Survivors gravitate toward pre-war construction because it offers a quality of shelter that post-war improvised structures cannot match. Factions build their headquarters in pre-war facilities because the infrastructure, the water systems, the power connections, the structural integrity still provides capabilities that are enormously difficult to replicate from scratch. The things that have not survived tell their own stories. The hospitals of the pre-war world were filled with medical knowledge and pharmaceutical supplies that are, 2 centuries later, almost entirely consumed or destroyed. The libraries that the pre-war world built to preserve its accumulated knowledge have been picked over by generations of scavengers and scholars and desperate people who burned whatever would burn to keep warm. The manufacturing capacity, the factories and production lines and supply chains that produced the pre-war world's material abundance is gone, dismantled or destroyed or simply corroded past the point where restoration is feasible. What this means for the people living in the wasteland is a relationship with material goods that is radically different from the pre-war relationship. Manufactured objects, pre-war guns, pre-war electronics, pre-war pharmaceuticals, are treated with a reverence proportional to how difficult they are to replace, which is considerable. A pre-war shotgun is worth more than its functional equivalent as a weapon because it was made to higher tolerances than any post-war fabrication can achieve, because its materials are of better quality, because it will last longer with minimal maintenance. The Brotherhood's hoarding instinct, while ideologically overdetermined in its formal justification, reflects a real material reality. Pre-war technology is irreplaceable, and every piece that is lost or destroyed is gone permanently. The loss of institutional knowledge is perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Great War. Physical materials can sometimes be replaced, or alternatives can be found. The processes, the expertise, the accumulated practical wisdom that allowed the pre-war world to manufacture complex goods, these exist only in documents and in the minds of people trained in them. And both documents and people have been disappearing from the wasteland for 200 years. The scribes of the Brotherhood of Steel are engaged in a genuine preservation effort, whatever their other motivations, and the followers of the Apocalypse's mission of knowledge preservation responds to a genuine crisis that is already in progress and will continue to worsen with each generation. The pre-war medical system, for example, was capable of treating conditions that are death sentences in the wasteland. Radiation poisoning of the kind that is endemic in the wasteland can be managed with certain pre-war pharmaceutical compounds, Rad-X and Radaway, which appear throughout the games as essential consumables, but the knowledge of how to manufacture these compounds is not widely distributed, and the manufacturing capacity for them is essentially zero. Stimpaks, the pre-war auto-injectors that provide rapid healing of trauma, are similarly irreplaceable as manufactured goods, though some post-war communities have developed partial analogs using available biochemical resources. The gap between pre-war medical capability and post-war medical reality represents an enormous amount of human suffering that is invisible in the broad historical narrative, but pervasive in the individual lives of people living in the wasteland. What endures, against all of this, is the particular human capacity for adaptation that the Fallout universe consistently respects. 2 centuries of necessity have produced innovations at the level of individual communities that are remarkable, even by pre-war standards in some respects. The water purification methods developed by various wasteland communities working with available materials, often without the reference documentation that would have guided pre-war engineers, represent genuine problem-solving. The weapons fabrication techniques that have emerged from the constraint of having access only to scavenged materials have produced items like the pipe gun family that are not as good as pre-war firearms, but are good enough, and are made from materials that are available everywhere. The medical practices of skilled wasteland doctors, working from preserved pre-war texts and extensive practical experience, have produced an informal medicine that saves lives. The wasteland is not as lost as it looks from the outside. It is an enormously difficult environment, full of dangers that the pre-war world never faced and lacking most of the resources that made the pre-war world's quality of life possible. But it is not static. It is not simply the ruins of something that was frozen in its moment of destruction. It is a place where people are building, generation by generation, something that they are not yet sure of the shape of. The uncertainty is real. So is the building. The neon signs stay lit in New Vegas. The water flows clean in the Potomac. In Appalachia's hills, something green grows through the cracks in the old world's foundations. The Pip-Boy on your wrist chirps cheerfully and marks another location on the map. There is always another location on the map. The wasteland is enormous, and it is full, and it is strange, and it is still, somehow, home to the people who live in it. Rest now. Let the amber light fall across the ruins. Let the sound of Galaxy News Radio fade into something almost like silence. The wasteland will still be here when you wake up, as it always has been, patient and strange and waiting. If you made it all the way through this lore exploration, thank you for listening. There is something right about sitting with the Fallout universe in the quiet, in the dark, when the sounds of the ordinary world have softened. These stories reward exactly that kind of slow attention. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and which part of this history stayed with you the longest. If you haven't already subscribed, there is always more lore to explore together, more nights to explore it on. Sleep well, wanderer. The wasteland will be there in the morning. Section 17. The Mojave's Hidden Stories. Dead Money, Honest Hearts, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road. Fallout New Vegas is not simply the main game's story of factions competing over Hoover Dam. It contains, in its 4 major DLC expansions, 4 of the most thematically rich stories in the entire Fallout series, each one focused on a different aspect of the post-war human condition, each one set in a location with its own distinct atmosphere and logic, each one concerned with a question that the main game raises but does not fully answer. Dead Money takes place in the Sierra Madre, a luxury resort villa that was completed just before the Great War and never opened. Its grand casino pristine and untouched and utterly deadly. The Sierra Madre was protected during the war by an automated security system that, in the post-war decades, proved to have been considerably more effective than its designers intended. A toxic red cloud fills the resort's exterior spaces, eating through materials and making prolonged exposure fatal. Holographic security guards' projections that can be damaged but always return, ghosts in the machine that the machine will not release patrol the streets. And somewhere in the resort's depths, a cache of pre-war goods valuable enough that people have been trying to reach it for 2 centuries, and failing. The courier is brought to the Sierra Madre against their will, along with a small group of other people, a nightclub singer named Dean Domino who has been waiting at the resort for 200 years, his ghoulification having preserved him through a vigil of obsessive anticipation. Christine Royce, a Brotherhood scribe who has been subjected to surgeries that removed her ability to speak, and Dog God, a super mutant with a split personality, one side simple and violent, the other educated and anguished. These 4 people, forced together by circumstances, must cooperate to navigate the Sierra Madre and access the vault at its heart. Dead Money's central theme is attachment specifically, the destructive consequences of refusing to let go. Dean Domino has been attached to the Sierra Madre for 200 years, unable to move forward, unable to abandon the dream of the heist he was planning when the bombs fell. The founder of the Sierra Madre, a man named Frederick Sinclair, built the resort as an obsessive monument to a woman named Vera Keyes, whose recorded voice still echoes through the resort's speakers, preserved in holograms and automated broadcasts. The cloud, the traps, the elaborate security, all of it built by a man who couldn't let go. Dead Money is Fallout at its most intimate and its most unsparing, a story about what attachment costs when it becomes compulsion. Honest Hearts takes place in Zion National Park, in what was once Utah, a landscape that received very little direct nuclear strike damage, and that has recovered into something genuinely beautiful forests and rivers and red rock canyons that look almost like the real Zion. transformed by 2 centuries of post-war ecological development into something simultaneously familiar and strange. The courier arrives in Zion as part of a trading expedition and becomes involved in a conflict between the Whitelegs Raider tribe and the various tribes of Zion's permanent population. The heart of Honest Hearts is Joshua Graham the Burned Man, Caesar's former legate who was set on fire and thrown into the Colorado River after a military defeat that Caesar could not forgive, who survived through sheer biological determination and who has, in the years since, rebuilt himself into something that is at once deeply Christian in its faith and entirely capable of killing, when killing is what the situation requires. Graham is one of the most memorable characters in the Fallout series, a man living in the specific tension between his genuine religious conviction and his continuing capacity for violence, who has not resolved that tension and is not sure it can be resolved, who has decided to act according to his faith as best he can while acknowledging that he is not the person his faith would ideally describe. Honest Hearts is concerned with the question of when violence is justified, when the use of force in defense of the weak is an expression of genuine values rather than a surrender to the wasteland's logic. Graham's answer is carefully qualified. Violence is sometimes necessary, never desirable, always costly in ways that go beyond the physical, and must be accompanied by the willingness to live with its consequences, without rationalization. Old World Blues is the most deliberately strange of the DLC expansions, a science fiction story within a science fiction story set in the Big MT Research Facility, a pre-war scientific installation that has been run for 200 years by a collection of disembodied brains and tanks. The courier's brain has been extracted and replaced with a cybernetic substitute, and they must navigate the Big MT, encounter the eccentric and often comedic personalities of the think tank scientists, and eventually confront the question of what it means to be a person when the physical substrate of your identity has been altered. Old World Blues is Fallout's clearest statement about the pre-war world's relationship with science, the conviction that anything that could be done should be done, that the absence of ethical constraints on research was a feature rather than a bug, that the question, what will this do to a person, was less important than the question, what can we learn from doing this to a person? The Big MT's scientists were not evil in any traditional sense. They were simply unconstrained, free to follow their intellectual curiosity wherever it led, and where it led them was somewhere genuinely terrible. Their continued existence as disembodied brains arguing about methodology in the ruins of their facility is both darkly funny and deeply sad. Lonesome Road is the most personal of the DLC stories. A confrontation between the courier and a man named Ulysses, who has been waiting for them, who believes the courier is responsible for a catastrophe in the Divide, a settlement that was once one of the Mojave Wasteland's most promising communities. Ulysses is one of Fallout's most carefully constructed characters, a former Legion member whose disillusionment with both Caesar's Legion and the NCR has produced a philosophy that sees the destruction of both as the only honest response to a world of unsatisfying choices. The Divide, the shattered, wind-torn landscape that is Lonesome Road's setting, is what happened when the courier unknowingly carried a package to a location that triggered a series of buried nuclear warheads, destroying a community of survivors who had been building something genuinely good. The courier's role in this destruction was indirect and unknowing, but it was real, and Ulysses has spent years preparing a confrontation that he believes will force the courier to account for it. Lonesome Road's climax involves a choice about whether to launch nuclear missiles at the NCR and/or Legion territories, a choice that the DLC allows, but that forces the player to sit with the implications in ways that the main game's faction choices don't. The Divide's atmosphere, a landscape of destroyed potential, of the ruins of something that was being built, and that was ended not by malice, but by ignorance and unfortunate coincidence, is the most visually specific of any Fallout New Vegas environment, a sustained meditation on the particular grief of losing something before you knew it was possible. Section 18. The Pit, Point Lookout, and the Wasteland Beyond. Fallout 3's own DLC expansions explored wasteland regions beyond the capital wasteland, each bringing its own specific character and thematic concerns. The Pit, the ruins of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is perhaps the most politically pointed environment in the entire Fallout series. By the time the Lone Wanderer reaches it in Operation Anchorage's aftermath, the Pit has become an industrial settlement organized around a steel mill that produces the metal that the wasteland desperately needs. The organization of the Pit is a kind of industrial feudalism, a group of raiders, led by a former slave named Asher who has developed surprisingly sophisticated ideas about rebuilding civilization, run the mill using slave labor drawn from the wasteland's most vulnerable populations. The slaves live in the pit's lower districts, working conditions that are brutal, with access to food and shelter that is barely adequate. The lone wanderer arrives at the pit having been contacted by a slave named Wernher, who wants help freeing the slave population. The political situation they find is more complicated than Werner's framing suggested. Asher genuinely believes in what he's building, in a way that is coherent even if its moral costs are enormous, and the pit's steel production genuinely matters for the wasteland communities that depend on it. A cure for the horrific mutation disease that afflicts the pit's slave population is being developed, and the source of the cure's key ingredient is Asher's infant daughter. The first child born in the pit without the mutation, whose blood contains whatever biological factor allows normal human development in the pit's toxic environment. The pit doesn't resolve its central question cleanly. The player can choose to free the slaves, which destroys the cure's development timeline and leaves the remaining population to work out its own governance with uncertain results. The player can support Asher, which leaves the slaves in their condition but preserves the institutional structure and the cure's development. Neither choice is fully satisfying. The pit is Fallout at its most deliberately uncomfortable, refusing to provide a moral exit. Point Lookout, a coastal marshland DLC, is a different kind of story, more focused on mystery and on the particular psychological texture of an isolated post-war community that has developed its own strange culture in geographic and social isolation. The coastal marshes of Maryland, lightly touched by the direct nuclear exchange but deeply affected by the environmental contamination of the post-war decades, have produced a landscape of extraordinary strangeness: Spanish moss on mutated trees, tidal waterways full of things that were not there before the war, a community of swamp people who have adapted to their environment in ways that make them barely recognizable as members of the same species as the capital wasteland's regular residents. Point Lookout's story involves a conflict between the descendants of pre-war residents who have maintained some degree of historical memory and the various forces that want to exploit the region's particular resources. The tone is different from the main game's quieter, more atmospheric, less concerned with faction politics, and more concerned with the specific texture of a place and its relationship to its own history. It is, in some ways, the most overtly Southern Gothic of any Fallout environment, leaning into the horror that lives in beautiful decayed landscapes. Section 19. The Timeline of History from Vault-76 to the Far Future. The chronology of the Fallout universe, assembled from the various games and the television series, covers approximately 300 years of post-war history, from the opening of Vault-76 in 2102 to the events of the television series in 2296 and 2297. Fallout 76, set in 2102, is the earliest chronological point in the main series games. It documents the first 25 years after the Great War in Appalachia, the initial formation of post-war communities, and the emergence of the Scorchbeast threat. The Vault Dwellers who emerge in 2102 are the first-generation people who entered the Vault as adults or children, and are now emerging into a world they have no direct experience with. The first Fallout game, set in 2161, takes place 84 years after Vault 76. In those 84 years, the California wasteland has developed enough that stable communities exist. The Hub, Shady Sands, the Gunrunners, and the Brotherhood of Steel has established itself as the dominant military power in the region. The Vault Dweller's journey from Vault 13 introduces the wasteland's basic structure to the player in a form that feels both historically established and actively evolving. Fallout 2, set in 2241, is another 80 years further along. In those 80 years, the NCR has formally founded. Vault City has developed as one of the wasteland's most technologically advanced communities, one of the few vaults that actually served its stated purpose, becoming the nucleus of a functional post-war civilization, and the political landscape of the California wasteland has developed considerably. The Chosen One's journey is one of a wasteland that is further from the immediate post-war survival crisis and closer to the political conflicts of a civilization that is actually trying to rebuild itself. The gap between Fallout 2 in 2241 and Fallout 3 in 2277 is 36 years. The Capital Wasteland's story is temporally separated from the California games by those decades of development, during which the NCR has continued to expand and the Brotherhood has continued to spread eastward, and the various post-war communities of the eastern seaboard have developed their own distinctive characters. Fallout New Vegas, set in 2281, is 4 years after Fallout 3. The events of the Capital Wasteland Project Purity's activation, the destruction of the Enclave's Raven Rock base, are recent history in New Vegas's timeline, known about in broad strokes by people who pay attention to political developments east of the mountains. Fallout 4, set in 2287, is 6 years after New Vegas. The Institute's rise in the Commonwealth has been ongoing for decades, but the arrival of the Prydwen and the sole survivors' emergence from Vault 111 represent a catalytic moment in the Commonwealth's political development. The Minutemen's restoration, the Railroad's confrontation with the Institute, the Brotherhood's technological dominance of the region, all of these are consequences of choices made in the previous months and years. The television series jumps forward nearly a decade to 2296, and the jump reveals how much has changed in ways the games did not directly show. The Shady Sands catastrophe, the nuclear destruction of the NCR's capital, represents either the end of the new California Republic or a severe setback from which it may or may not recover, depending on how subsequent seasons of the show choose to develop the story. The presence in 2296 of characters and factions whose histories span multiple games gives the show an opportunity to show the long-term consequences of the choices made across the games in ways that individual games, focused on their own specific timelines, could not fully explore. What is consistent across all of these chronological points is the sense that the wasteland is always in the middle of something, rather than at a beginning or an end. There was a world before the games began, with its own history and its own consequences, and there will be a world after the game's end that the game's events will shape. The Fallout universe is historical in a genuine sense. It has a past that influences its present, and its present is creating a future that cannot be fully predicted. The choices made by the various player characters across the games are part of a historical process that continues beyond any individual story. Section 20. Megaton, Rivet City, and the Texture of Wasteland Community. The communities of the Capital Wasteland deserve attention not just as plot locations but as genuinely imagined places, settlements that feel inhabited and specific in ways that illuminate what post-war community building actually looks like on the human scale. Megaton is perhaps the most distinctive. The settlement was built inside and around an impact crater, left by a pre-war bomb that failed to detonate a nuclear device that sits at the center of the town's largest space, still armed. Its presence, the single most significant fact about Megaton's geography and psychology. The settlers who founded Megaton built their homes in a circle around the bomb, welding together pre-war metal scraps and scavenged construction materials into structures that wrap around the crater's inside walls like layers of an archaeological dig. At the bottom, the bomb. Above it, the community. The decision to build around the bomb rather than detonating it or moving away from it was made by Megaton's founders for reasons that included practical considerations. The crater provided natural, defensible boundaries, but also something that might be called philosophical. The bomb was already there. The wasteland was full of things that were already there, dangerous and present and impossible to fully remove or ignore. Building around the danger rather than pretending it wasn't there was, in a certain light, the wasteland's fundamental adaptive strategy applied at the architectural scale. Megaton has a sheriff, a general store, a bar called Moriarty's Saloon, a doctor's office, a settler family with the last name of Palmer, a church of the Children of the Atom whose congregants worship the undetonated bomb as a sacred object, and all the social texture of a place where people know each other's names and have opinions about each other. It is not a large community, perhaps 36 residents, but it is a real one, with the kind of interpersonal dynamics and small-scale politics that develop whenever people share a space long enough. Rivet City is something else entirely. The aircraft carrier permanently beached in the Potomac, its exact pre-war history is uncertain. Its post-war purpose, entirely a product of its survivors' ingenuity, is one of the Fallout universe's most visually spectacular communities, and one of its most socially complex. Hundreds of people live in Rivet City, enough to support genuine institutional specialization, a marketplace with multiple vendors, a science lab where researchers continue their work, a bar, a church, a history informed by the social tensions that arise whenever a significant number of people share a restricted space for an extended period. Rivet City has a history of violence in its past, a conflict that divided the community along factional lines and left wounds that have not fully healed decades later. The political dynamics of the carrier's various neighborhoods reflect this history, with different areas of the ship controlled by groups that have their own characters and interests. The science community, led by Dr. Madison Lee, maintains a kind of institutional independence that gives Rivet City some of its particular character, the presence of researchers who are actually doing research, whose work connects the wasteland to the pre-war tradition of systematic investigation, is unusual and interesting. Little Lamplight, the underground community of children who live in a former tourist cavern system, represents one of the wasteland's strangest social experiments, a community that, by its own constitutional rules, expels any member who reaches adulthood. The children of Little Lamplight have organized themselves with impressive effectiveness. They have functional leadership, resource management, and defensive protocols, and their community has survived for decades. The adults who have been expelled do sometimes survive in nearby Big Town, though their transition from the protected environment of Little Lamplight to the dangers of the open wasteland is often difficult. The existence of Little Lamplight raises questions about what happens to the social norms that develop in isolated communities when those communities have no contact with the wider world's conventions. The children of Little Lamplight have developed their own idiom, their own hierarchies, their own relationship to adult authority that is complicated by the fact that adult authority has been systematically excluded from their community. They are, in some ways, the wasteland's most interesting political experiment, proof that children can organize functional communities, and proof that the organizational forms they develop without adult input are genuinely different from the ones that adults would build. Section 21. The Courier and the Lone Wanderer, Identity at the Wasteland's Heart. The player characters of the Fallout series are among the most interesting constructions in gaming's history of protagonist design because they are simultaneously completely open, defined by the player's choices, and completely embedded in specific circumstances that give them genuine historical weight, regardless of those choices. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 has a more specific personal history than most open-world game protagonists. They were born in Vault 101, grew up within its sealed environment, and have an identity formed entirely by that closed world before they are ejected into the wasteland. Their mother died at their birth. Their father left in the night. They carry both of these facts through the entire game, and the emotional weight they accumulate shapes how the player experiences the capital wasteland, even as the player's choices determine what the Lone Wanderer actually does within it. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 carries even more specific personal weight. They had a life before the war, a spouse, a child, memories of the world as it was. 200 years of cryogenic sleep have not erased those memories, and the gap between the world they remember and the world they wake into is one of the most emotionally charged aspects of the game. They are the only Fallout protagonist who has a direct personal connection to the pre-war world, and that connection gives their interactions with pre-war objects and locations, the house they lived in, the neighborhood they walked, the sanctuary hills that is now a ruin, a specific quality of recognition and grief. The Courier of Fallout New Vegas is the most deliberately blank of the major protagonists. Their history before the game's events is almost entirely unknown, even to them, and the game's starting point is literally a bullet removed from their head, a memory wipe imposed by violence. What they build from that emptiness, the alliances they form, the enemies they make, the vision of the Mojave Wasteland's future they commit to, is entirely determined by the player. The Courier's blankness is the game's invitation. The Mojave Wasteland is a complex moral landscape, and the player is given the emptiest possible vessel through which to navigate it, the better to ensure that the navigation itself is genuinely the player's own. All of the protagonists share one quality that is fundamental to the Fallout series' appeal. They are competent. Not superhumanly so, not immune to the challenges of the wasteland, but genuinely capable of engaging with what the wasteland presents them with. The SPECIAL character system: strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck, is a framework for defining what kind of competence the protagonist has developed, and the various skills and perks built on that framework allow for specialization in ways that reflect genuine diversity of approach. A high-intelligence, high-speech character navigates the wasteland very differently from a high-strength, high-guns character, and both approaches are valid. The Pip-Boy that each protagonist carries serves as both the game's interface and an in-universe object with genuine meaning. It is the player's connection to the character's inner life, showing health, inventory, map position, quest objectives, and it is the character's connection to their own history, carrying personal notes and quest logs that accumulate into a record of the journey. The Pip-Boy's amber screen glow in the dark is one of the most recognizable visual elements of the series, and its warm light against the wasteland's gray ruins has a quality of persistence small, maintained. The light carried by a person moving through the dark. The VAT system, the Vault-Tec assisted targeting system, is, within the fiction, a combat assistance tool built into the Pip-Boy that allows the user to target specific body parts of enemies with calculated precision. Outside the fiction, it is the mechanic that allows the Fallout series to slow time and highlight the most cinematically brutal aspects of its combat in slow motion. The headshot that removes a super mutant's skull from a significant distance. The arm that flies off when a particularly powerful weapon connects with it. VATS is simultaneously a tactical tool and a theatrical one, and the combination is very Fallout practical and darkly funny, and a little bit much, in exactly the proportions that the series has always maintained. The endings of the Fallout games, the slideshows that document what happened to the Wasteland's major communities as a result of the player's choices, are one of the series' most specific formal choices. Rather than a single narrative conclusion, the games offer a fragmented documentary account of consequences, region by region and faction by faction, acknowledging that the Wasteland is a complex place and that actions taken in one part of it have effects throughout. The Courier's choices about the NCR, the Legion, Mr. House, and the various communities of the Mojave all have documented outcomes in New Vegas's ending slideshows. The Lone Wanderer's choices about the Capital Wasteland's various communities are similarly documented. The endings are not always happy. Sometimes the communities the player tried to help fail anyway because of factors outside the player's control. Sometimes unexpected positive outcomes emerge from choices that seemed unlikely to produce them. The Wasteland does not reward simple moral calculations, and neither do its endings. Section 22. The Quiet Places: Finding Stillness in the Fallout Universe. There are moments in the Fallout games that exist entirely outside the faction conflicts and survival challenges and the moral weight of the major narrative decisions moments that are simply about being in a particular place at a particular time, experiencing the specific quality of light or sound or atmosphere that the game has created there. The view from the top of a pre-war skyscraper in the Commonwealth, looking out over the ruins of Boston as the sun sets and the amber light does whatever it always does to ruins, making them look simultaneously catastrophic and beautiful. The specific quality of silence inside an abandoned vault, where the sounds of the outside world cannot reach and the hum of the ventilation system and the fluorescent lights create a background that is not silence exactly, but something that functions like it. The moment when you crest a hill in the Mojave and the lights of New Vegas become visible on the horizon, a whole city lit up in the dark, an impossible promise that somehow exists. The sunset sarsaparilla bottles scattered throughout the Mojave, their amber glass catching whatever light is available, a pre-war beverage company's product preserved in sufficient numbers that they are everywhere, omnipresent reminders of a commercial culture that is entirely gone except for its residue. The specific sound that a Nuka-Cola machine makes when it dispenses a bottle, a mechanical whir and a clunk, and then the bottle appearing in the slot, a sound so thoroughly associated with the Fallout universe that hearing it produces the immediate recognition of being in that world. The weight of a laser rifle in the inventory screen, its pre-war manufacture clear from its lines, a weapon that was made with care by people who had the time and the materials for care, and that has survived 200 years in better condition than most of the world around it. The graves. Every inhabited area of the wasteland has graves the people who have died there and have been buried by those who survived them. Sometimes with markers that identify them and sometimes without. Sometimes with personal objects that the survivors wanted to honor them with and sometimes with nothing. The graves are the most direct evidence of something that the wasteland's harshness sometimes obscures, that the people living there care about each other, that death is mourned, that the people who have died are not simply removed from the calculation, but are carried by the community in the way that all communities carry their dead. The terminals with unfinished personal diary entries, where the person writing had stopped mid-thought for some reason that can be guessed at but never known with certainty. The holotapes with personal recordings, someone telling a joke to a friend who never heard it, someone recording a message for a family member in another vault, someone practicing a speech they were going to give at a community meeting. The community long since dissolved. The evidence of individual human lives, specific and irreplaceable, preserved in data, and slowly being lost as the hardware that holds that data degrades. The Fallout universe is, in the end, a monument to the specificity of things, to the specificity of objects, this bottle, this terminal, this grave marker, and to the specificity of the people those objects represent. The pre-war world produced an enormous quantity of specific things, and the post-war world is a landscape of specific things arranged in patterns that tell specific stories. Reading those stories, finding them in the corners of abandoned buildings and the backs of vault terminals and the holotapes scattered across the landscape, is one of the quiet pleasures of the series. The reward for taking the time to look carefully at what is actually there. That careful looking is, in some ways, what the Fallout series is inviting. The big narrative questions: who should rule the Mojave? What is the future of synthetic life? Whether civilization can be rebuilt or will only be replaced by something that resembles it from a distance, are real and important questions, and the games take them seriously. But the real texture of the experience, the thing that makes the Fallout universe worth returning to, is the accumulation of small, specific observations. The world has been destroyed, and the evidence of what it was is everywhere, and something new is being built in its ruins, and all of it is happening at the scale of individual human beings making individual human choices in specific circumstances. The wasteland is enormous, and it is full, and it is strange, and it is worth looking at carefully in the amber light of whatever time of day it happens to be when you find yourself in it. Rest now. The story doesn't end here. It never ends in the Fallout universe, because the universe itself keeps going. New games and new stories and new specific corners of the wasteland to find and to sit with in the quiet. There is always more. The wastes are vast. Sleep well and dream of something green growing through the cracks. If you've spent this time with the Fallout universe and found something useful here, whether you drifted off to sleep or simply sat with the lore for a while, thank you for being here. Comments about where you're watching from and what part of the wasteland's history speaks to you most are always welcome. Subscribing means more of this kind of deep, slow exploration waiting for you whenever you need it. The wasteland keeps giving if you keep looking. Sleep well. Section 23. The Institute, the Railroad, and the question that won't resolve. The question at the center of Fallout 4, whether Gen 3 synths are people, is not a question the game answers. This is deliberate and correct. The game presents the evidence on multiple sides, lets the player encounter individual synths whose personhood is difficult to doubt, and meet Institute scientists whose position is internally coherent, even if its moral consequences are devastating, and then places the player in a position of having to choose how to act within that uncertainty. Nick Valentine is perhaps the clearest individual case the game offers. Nick is a synth, one of the early Gen 2 models, recognizable as non-human, his synthetic face and exposed mechanical components, making clear what he is to anyone who looks. But Nick carries the memories of a pre-war police detective who was killed before the war, and those memories inform his personality, his values, his way of engaging with the world. He is a detective because the man whose memories he carries was a detective, and he pursues cases with the combination of professional competence and personal investment that any good detective brings to work they genuinely care about. Is Nick Valentine a person? The question feels almost rhetorical when asked about him specifically, because his personhood is so present in his behavior and his relationships. He has an established reputation in Diamond City. He has friends and enemies and complicated feelings about his own nature that he has spent significant time working through. He is not pretending to be a person. There is no performance involved, no mask over something mechanical underneath. He is simply what he is, which is something that exists at the uncertain boundary of a category that the pre-war world defined and the post-war world has been forced to reconsider. The Institute's position that Gen 3 synths are sophisticated tools, products rather than persons, created for purposes defined by their creators, is not incoherent. There is a genuine philosophical tradition applied to questions of AI consciousness that the pre-war world was already debating before the war, that would support the conclusion that sufficiently sophisticated behavior is not the same as genuine consciousness, that the appearance of personhood is not identical to its reality. The Institute's scientists are not simply being cruel, when they process captured synths for memory wipes and redeployment. They are acting on a conclusion about the nature of what they have created that is at least arguable. The Railroad's position that Gen 3 synths are people, that their experiences constitute genuine subjective experience, that their claim to freedom is identical in moral weight to any biological person's claim is equally not incoherent. The philosophical tradition on the other side of that debate is at least as well developed, and the behavioral evidence of individual synths like Nick Valentine is exactly the kind of evidence that that tradition would point to. The Railroad is acting on a moral conviction about persons that is consistent with a well-developed ethical framework. The Brotherhood of Steel's position that the question is irrelevant, that what matters is the technological threat posed by the Institute's work, regardless of the nature of the individual synths it produces, is the only position in the game that explicitly refuses to engage with the moral question. This refusal is itself a kind of answer, of course, but it is an answer that the game marks as inadequate. The Brotherhood's technological absolutism, its willingness to treat the moral status of synthetic beings as a distraction from the primary question of technological control, is presented with enough critical distance that the player is invited to notice what is missing from it. The Minutemen's implicit position that the question, while real, is less urgent than the immediate defense of Commonwealth settlements, and that taking a strong stand on the synth question would make the Minutemen's practical coalition building more difficult, is the most politically pragmatic of the available positions, and therefore the most cowardly, even as it is the most understandable. The Minutemen need to be able to recruit anyone who wants to help defend settlers, regardless of their position on Institute policy. What makes Fallout 4's central question genuinely interesting, rather than a simple moral puzzle with an obvious answer, is that the game's presentation takes all of these positions seriously. The Institute scientists are not simple monsters. They are people who have built something extraordinary in genuinely difficult circumstances, who have sustained a research program across generations, who have chosen a kind of institutional commitment to scientific advancement that required them to make certain moral choices that they have lived with. The Brotherhood operatives are not simply bigots, they are people acting on a coherent set of values that have served the organization well in certain respects, even if those values produce blind spots in this particular situation. The Railroad operatives are not simply heroes, they are people taking on genuinely dangerous commitments based on a moral conviction that might be right or might be overclaiming consciousness in entities that don't actually have it. The game asks the player to choose in the absence of the philosophical certainty that would make the choice easy. This is honest. The real moral challenges of the world we actually live in tend to look exactly like this, complicated by uncertainty, informed by competing evidence, not resolvable by any algorithm that can be run without remainder. Section 24. The Sound of History Fragments, Holotapes, and the Poetry of Ruins. There is a holotape in Fallout 4, found in a house in the ruins of the Boston suburbs, that contains a recording of a mother reading a bedtime story to her child. The story is a simple one, the kind of story that exists in 100 different forms in the pre-war world's children's literature. An adventure with a happy ending, written to be read aloud, with the rhythm and repetition that makes such stories easy to fall asleep to. The recording is good quality, preserved in the holotape medium that proves far more durable than most other recording technologies the pre-war world used. The mother's voice is clear and warm and unhurried, the voice of someone who has read this story many times and who enjoys reading it again. The child that recording was made for has been dead for 200 years. The house where the holotape was found is a ruin. The world that produced both the recording and the house and the family that lived in it has been gone for 200 years. But the voice is there, in the holotape, and when you play it, it is simply a mother's voice reading a bedtime story, immediate and present in a way that nothing else in the wasteland quite is. These fragments, the personal recordings, the diary entries, the notes left for people who never received them, are what the Fallout universe does better than almost any other post-apocalyptic setting. The apocalypse in Fallout is not abstract. It is always made concrete through specific human beings in specific circumstances, and the specificity is what makes the loss feel real. There is a series of holotapes in Fallout 3 that documents the story of a man who survived the Great War in a bunker with a small group of strangers and who recorded his experiences over the weeks and months that followed. The early tapes are practical inventory assessments, daily logs, the organized record-keeping of someone who has retained their professional habits in extreme circumstances. The middle tapes become more personal, as the strains of close confinement and uncertainty start to show in the recording. The later tapes are something else entirely, a record of a mind under pressure, of relationships forming and breaking, of the specific texture of what it is to be alive and afraid and uncertain of whether the world outside has anything left to offer. The man's voice across these tapes changes in ways that are immediately recognizable as human. The shifts in register that come with emotional pressure, the small vocal tells that indicate fatigue or fear or something approaching hope, the moments when he pauses in the middle of a sentence because he is not sure what to say next. He is one person, in one bunker, in one specific historical moment. The Fallout universe is enormous, containing centuries of history and hundreds of individual stories, but it accumulates that enormity one voice at a time. This is ultimately what the Fallout series believes about history, that it is made of individual human experiences, and that the individual experiences matter as much as the large patterns. The Great War is the largest event in the series' history, a catastrophe of civilizational scale. But it is not experienced at civilizational scale by the people living through it. It is experienced as a specific morning, a specific moment, a specific set of choices about what to do in the hours immediately after, a specific series of days that follow. The historical and the personal are not separate registers, they are the same register, experienced at different scales simultaneously. The holotapes and terminal entries and personal notes of the Fallout universe are that series' argument that the personal scale is the one that ultimately matters. Not because the large patterns are unimportant, the faction conflicts and the technological arms races, and the civilizational questions about what comes after are genuinely important, but because those large patterns are meaningful only insofar as they affect specific people living specific lives. The mother reading a bedtime story to her child before the bombs fell is not a footnote to the history of the Great War. She is what the history of the Great War is about. The wasteland preserves her voice. It preserves all of these voices, scattered across its ruins in holotapes and terminal entries, and notes pinned to walls and carved into surfaces by people who wanted to leave something that would last. The Pip-Boy finds them, and the player hears them, and the accumulation of all those individual testimonies is what gives the Fallout universe its particular emotional weight, heavier than any individual story could be, lighter than the sheer enormity of the catastrophe it documents. The wasteland is full of voices. The amber light falls across the ruins. Something is always growing in the cracks. The Nuka-Cola machines hum their quiet mechanical hum, maintaining their patient readiness for customers who are never coming back. Rest now. The voices will be there when you return. They are patient, preserved in holotape and terminal memory, and the specific architecture of the ruins that contain them, waiting for whoever comes next with a Pip-Boy and the time to listen carefully. Sleep well. The wasteland is large and full of stories, and there is always more to find. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. If this helped you drift toward sleep, or simply gave you something quiet and rich to sit with, I'm glad. Comments about where you are in the world and which corner of this universe spoke to you most are genuinely appreciated. Subscribing means more explorations like this one, whenever you need them. Rest well, Wanderer. Section 25. The World That Keeps Going. Fallout's enduring resonance. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that the Fallout universe continues to grow. The first game was released in 1997, developed by a small studio with a modest budget and no certainty that anyone would care about a turn-based RPG set in an irradiated future America. It found its audience, and that audience has never entirely gone away. Nearly 3 decades later, the series has expanded across consoles and platforms and a live-action television adaptation, and each new entry finds new people encountering the wasteland for the first time and bringing their own curiosity to its ruins. What keeps people returning to a world that is, by any measure, a deeply uncomfortable place to spend time? The Fallout universe is dangerous and morally ambiguous and full of evidence of catastrophe. Its humor is dark enough that it sometimes passes through dark and comes out the other side into something that does not have a clean name. Its most interesting characters are often deeply compromised people making choices from within systems that compromise them further. It is not an escapist setting in any simple sense, The questions it raises about power and technology and what human beings do to one another under pressure are not questions that a person leaves behind when they put down the controller. And yet, the amber light, the sound of an old radio playing across the ruins, the moment when a settlement that was barely surviving becomes something more, and the specific people who live there have a little more security than they did before. The kindness of individual characters in a world that has every reason to be unkind. Codsworth waiting 200 years to greet his family. Nick Valentine doing detective work in a city that mostly regards him as a curiosity at best. The various wasteland wanderers who have simply decided that the world they live in is worth improving despite the evidence. The Fallout universe persists in the imagination because it takes seriously the question of what people do when civilization fails. Not in the abstract, in the specific, in the individual, in the accumulation of small choices made by people who do not have the luxury of historical perspective on the moment they are living through. The people of the Capital Wasteland and the Mojave and the Commonwealth and Appalachia are not living in history. They are living in their present, doing what they can with what they have, trying to protect what they care about, and build something worth having in the ruins of what was lost. This is, in the end, not so different from what people have always done. Civilizations have fallen before the Great War of the Fallout universe, and people have always been left in the ruins, trying to build something from what remains. The specific texture of the Fallout version of that story, the retrofuturism, the Nuka-Cola, the Vault-Tec vaults, the super mutants, the specific quality of that amber light is unique to this fictional universe. But the underlying human situation is one of the oldest human situations there is. The Fallout universe does not promise that things will be fine. It does not assure the player that civilization will be rebuilt, that the war was worth it, that the suffering produced some necessary historical result. It simply says, this is what happened, and these are the people living with what happened, and here is the specific texture of their lives in the ruins. What happens next is up to you, and what you choose will have consequences, and those consequences will shape the world for everyone in it. That is, if you think about it carefully, a fairly honest description of what it is to be alive in any historical moment. The world is always in some state of partial ruin and partial construction. The choices available are always constrained by circumstances that were not chosen. The consequences of action and inaction are always real and always affect other people. The Fallout universe renders all of this in bright, specific, sometimes darkly comic detail against a backdrop of actual apocalypse, and somehow manages to be a place worth visiting, worth exploring carefully, worth listening to, worth sitting with in the quiet. The Wasteland keeps its stories in amber. In holotape recordings and terminal entries and the personal effects of the dead, in the architectural bones of pre-war buildings, and the improvised structures that survivors have built within and around, and sometimes on top of them. In the music that plays from the radio stations, songs that were old before the bombs fell, that carry the specific emotional associations of the world they were made in, that play on in the ruins with an indifference to context that is, somehow, exactly right. Rest now. The wasteland will be there when you return unchanged in its ruins, always changing in the stories being made within those ruins, patient and enormous, and full of corners that no one has yet found and explored and sat quietly in for a moment. The amber light falls. The radio plays something from before. Somewhere, in the structure of a pre-war building that is still standing through some combination of good construction and good fortune, a terminal hums with the patient readiness of a machine waiting for its user to return. Sleep well, wanderer. You have walked a long way through the wasteland today. The ruins will keep. A final note. On choosing to care, there is a moment, in almost every Fallout game, when the weight of the world becomes briefly visible all at once. Not in a cutscene, not in a story beat designed to produce that feeling, but in a quiet moment of observation, standing on a height looking out over the ruins, or sitting in a settlement at night listening to the sounds of people sleeping inside their improvised shelters, or simply walking through a landscape that is broken and beautiful at the same time. In that moment, the player is not being asked to make a choice. No dialogue option is waiting. No enemy is approaching. The world is simply there, enormous and specific and full of evidence of everything that has happened to it. And the character keeps going anyway, not because the world is fixed or because the problems have been solved, but because the world contains people, and the people matter, and the act of caring about them is itself the thing that makes the journey worth taking. The Fallout universe is not optimistic in any simple or comfortable sense. It does not promise good outcomes. It does not guarantee that effort will be rewarded or that care will be sufficient. What it offers instead is something quieter and more honest, the suggestion that the caring itself has value, independent of the results, because it is the thing that makes a person rather than simply a survivor. The wasteland produces survivors in abundance. History is full of them. What it produces less reliably, what requires active cultivation, in the wasteland, as in any world, are people who survive and still choose to extend themselves toward others to carry more than just their own continuation. The Fallout universe is, finally, a long meditation on that choice, made again and again in small moments and large ones, by characters named and unnamed, across 200 years of documented history and the uncounted centuries before the bombs fell, and the specific present tense of whatever playthrough is happening right now. The bombs fell. The world kept going. People kept making choices. Some of those choices were terrible, and some were extraordinary, and most were somewhere in between, made by people doing their best in difficult circumstances with imperfect information and real stakes. That is the story. It is not finished. It is never finished, in the Fallout universe or anywhere else. Sleep well. The story will be waiting.